The smell of the office was not tobacco, though every man within it pretended otherwise to mask the scent of damp wool drying sluggishly against the cast-iron radiator, mingling with the sour, metallic tang of ink that had turned in the pot. Detective Inspector Thomas Bellamy rubbed the heel of his hand across his forehead, leaving a faint, grey smear of graphite on skin that felt too tight for the skull beneath. Outside, London grumbled under the heavy lid of a June evening that refused to surrender to darkness, the blackout curtains drawn with habitual precision against a sky that held no falling bombs anymore, only the lingering, dusty haze of a peace nobody quite knew how to inhabit. He shifted the stack of files, and the sharp edge of a manila folder sliced his thumb, drawing a bead of blood that he wiped absently onto his trousers. "Tea's gone cold, sir." Bellamy looked up to find Constable Halloway standing in the doorway, clutching a chipped mug with both hands as though drawing warmth from the ceramic itself. The boy had spent 3 years sweating through the jungles of Burma and still flinched when a lorry backfired on the Whitehall pavement, his eyes darting to the window before he remembered where he was. "Leave it." Mrs. Marshall rang again, third time this week. Halloway stepped into the room, his boots squeaking a protest against the worn linoleum, and set the mug down atop a pile of requisition forms Bellamy had intended to sign before lunch. "Says her daughter's come home. Says the whole thing is a mistake." "She is not mistaken." Bellamy picked up the top file, the cardboard cover soft and frayed at the corners from being passed through too many weary hands. "Doreen Marshall did not come home. She vanished from a bus stop in Herne Bay and was found on a mortuary slab in Bournemouth with her throat cut." Halloway flinched, the name Bournemouth carrying a new, terrible weight, heavy as a stone dropped into a pocket. It sat alongside other whispers, the ones the tabloids had not yet seized upon, but were already sniffing around like hungry dogs at a butcher's door. "There is another one," Bellamy said, opening the file marked Gardner Marjorie. The photograph inside was black and white, grainy enough to obscure the truth, showing a woman smiling with a confidence that made the stillness of her eyes unsettling. "Found in a hotel room, locked from the inside, same month, same sort of man seen loitering." "Same sort." "Officer class, polished shoes, a uniform without the insignia." Bellamy tapped the typewritten statement from a hotel clerk in London, the keys striking the paper with a force that suggested anger. "They all say he looked as though he belonged, as though he owned the place, but the name change, Rupert Brooke, Group Captain Heath, Major Vernon." Halloway leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms until the wood groaned under his weight. "Impersonating an officeress, a court-martial offense. If he is military, the provost marshal should be handling it." "He is not military, he is a butcher wearing a suit." Bellamy stood, his knees cracking with a dry sound like twigs snapping underfoot, and walked to the window to pull the curtain back an inch. The street below was grey and slick with recent rain, people hurrying home with bags of potatoes and powdered egg, nobody looking up because nobody ever did. "Get me the railway timetable. I need to know the next train to Bournemouth." "Sir, we have not got the requisition from Hampshire Constabulary yet. If we cross the border without written permission, the local boys will kick up a fuss about jurisdiction, and you know how protective they are down there." "Let them fuss." Bellamy turned from the window, the light from the desk lamp carving deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. "A woman is dead. Another is missing. The post moves slower than a man with a train ticket, and I am not waiting for a letter to tell me I am allowed to do my job." He sat back down and pulled the Gardner file closer, the forensic report thin and barely 3 pages long. Pathologists were overworked, buried under months of corpses from the war that still needed identifying before they could worry about a civilian murder in a seaside hotel. The cause of death was listed as ligature strangulation, but the notes hinted at something else, mentioning marks on theskin and patterns that did not belong to common rope. "Did you see the notes on the ligature?" Bellamy asked. Halloway shifted his weight uneasily. "The whip marks." "Not just a whip, something textured, perhaps leather with a knot." Bellamy traced the line of their port with a finger, feeling the ghost of the violence through the paper. "And the room, staged, shewers laid out, cleaned." "Sex crime." Possibly, yet it remains precise. While anger thrums within it, so too does procedure. Bellamy closed the file, the sound final like a coffin lid shutting. This man does not kill in a rage. He kills because he has decided to, much like filling out a form. Holloway pushed off the doorframe, tension leaving his shoulders as he promised to get the timetable. "I'll tell Mrs. Marshall you're coming," he added, explaining that she's staying at a boarding house in Clapham until she can go back to Herne Bay. "Tell her nothing, just tell her I'm coming." When the constable left, Thurroom settled back into its quiethum, the radiator clanking with arrhythmic knocking that matched the pulsing Bellamy's neck. He picked up his pen and hovered it over the requisition form for Hampshire, but instead of signing, he drew a line through the date and wrote personal inquiry in the margin. The ink bled into the paper, spreading slightly at the edges like a bruise. He thought about the mother's voice on the telephone earlier that day, trembling as she tried to hold onto a dignity the world had stripped away piece by piece. She wanted her daughter to be a girl who got lost, not a girl who was hunted, for it wastes her to believe in a Mistakethan, a monster. Bellamy knew that feeling, having felt it in 40 when the V1s started falling, pretending noise was just thunder so the children would sleep. But there was no thunder, no, only the scratch of Thepin and the smell of Dampwool. He opened the drawer off his desk and took out a packet of Woodbines, the ration Titan saved for the weekend. Yethai's hands were shaking slightly. A tremor he could not suppress no matter how much tea he drank. Hell it won, the smoke curling up to the ceiling to join the haze that hung permanently in Theophis, staining the plaster yellow. The file on Doreen Marshall lay open, her photograph showing a woman in a summer dress, standing in a garden, looking entirely ordinary. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage, and the carbolic soap landladies used to scrub the moral stain from their floorboards. Bellamy wiped his shoes on the coir mat, removing the grey slick of London pavement before he knocked on number 14. A woman opened the door, her hair set in tight waves that did not move when she shook her head. "Police." Bellamy showed his warrant card, the leather worn at the corners. "I'm here for Mrs. Marshall." "She's resting." The woman blocked the threshold, her shoulders squared against the intrusion. "She's had a terrible shock. I told the papers she wasn't receiving." "I'm not the papers." He stepped past her, not asking permission, forcing her to pivot or be knocked aside. She chose to pivot, clutching her apron as if it were a shield. "Which room?" "Top of the stairs, left." Bellamy climbed. The banister was sticky under his palm. Inside the room, the light was failing, dusk pressing against the windowpane like a thumb. Mrs. Marshall sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, though no fire burned, her hands folded in her lap around a handkerchief that had been twisted into a rope. She did not look up when he entered. He was a shadow, another weight in a room already heavy with grief. "Mrs. Marshall." He kept his voice low, removing his hat to show he was not a stranger bringing news she did not want. "I'm Detective Inspector Bellamy." "I know who you are." Her voice was dry, brittle as old paper. "You're the one who tells me where they found her." "I'm the one who finds out why." Bellamy pulled the only other chair into the light, the legs scraping against the linoleum with a sound that made her flinch. He sat, keeping his hands visible on his knees. "I need to talk to you about the people she met before she left Herne Bay." "She didn't meet anyone." Mrs. Marshall looked at the fireplace, where a few cold ashes lay undisturbed. "Doreen was a good girl. She worked at the canteen. She came home." "She didn't come home that night." "She was delayed." The denial came too quickly, a reflex honed by years of keeping up appearances in a street where neighbors watched curtains twitch. "The buses were unreliable. Everyone knows the buses are unreliable." Bellamy leaned forward, the wood of the chair creaking under his shift in weight. He could smell the lavender water she had dabbed on her wrists, a desperate attempt to mask the scent of fear that clung to her clothes. "We found letters in her bag, addressed to a group captain Rupert Brooke. Do you know him?" Her head snapped up, eyes wide and wet, the mask slipping to reveal the panic beneath. "She showed you those." "I'm asking you." "They were just letters." She unfolded the handkerchief, then folded it again, the fabric bunching in her fists. "She was lonely, Her father's been gone 3 years and the house is too quiet. A girl needs correspondence. Did she meet him? She said he was in London, on leave. Mrs. Marshall looked away, towards the window where the street lamp had just flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the carpet. She said he was kind, that he understood what it was like to lose things. Bellamy watched her hands. They were trembling, not from cold, but from the effort of holding back a confession that felt like a betrayal. He knew this dance. The war had taught every mother in England how to lie to protect the dead, to sanitize the final moments so they fit into a sermon rather than a coroner's report. He wasn't kind, Mrs. Marshall. Bellamy kept his tone flat, devoid of judgment. He used her, and if you hide what he wrote, you let him keep using her even now. He promised to write again. Her voice dropped to a whisper, the shame coloring her cheeks a dull red. She kept them in the tin box, under the bed. I told her not to keep things under the bed. It collects dust, but she wouldn't listen. Where is the box now? I burnt them. Bellamy waited. He let the silence stretch, filling the room until it became uncomfortable, pressing against her ribs. He knew she was lying because her eyes darted to the wardrobe, just for a fraction of a second, an involuntary twitch of the head that betrayed the location of every secret she owned. You burnt them. He stood up slowly, giving her time to stop him. Then there is nothing else I can do. If there is no evidence of him, then she was just a girl who wandered off. A runaway. That's what the papers will say. Canteen girl runs off with unknown sailor. No, Mrs. Marshall surged out of the chair, her knee knocking against the small table so that the cold teacup rattled in its saucer. She wasn't like that. She was waiting for him. He was coming to take her away from all this. She swept her arm around the room, encompassing the boarding house, the rationing, the grey world outside. He had a car. He said he had a car. Show me the letters. Mrs. Marshall collapsed back into the chair, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had arrived. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small bundle of envelopes, tied with a piece of blue ribbon. The paper was cream, expensive, the kind that was impossible to buy in a shop since '42. She held them out, her fingers reluctant to let go of the string. He wrote beautifully. Her voice broke. You wouldn't think a man who wrote like that could do harm. Bellamy took the bundle. The paper felt smooth, heavy with the weight of the lies printed upon it. He did not open them there. He slipped them into his inside pocket, next to his own heart, where they would stay warm until he could read them under a lamp that did not flicker. Thank you. He turned to the door, the wood cold under his hand. Stay here. Don't talk to the press. If they come, tell them I told you nothing. Will you catch him? Bellamy paused, his hand on the latch. He thought about the gouges in the bedpost at the Norfolk Royal, the smell of perfume masking blood, the bureaucratic lag that would let a man buy a train ticket while a warrant sat in a tray in London. I'm going to Bournemouth, he said. He's there. He's there, hope flared in her eyes, bright and terrible, alive. For now. Bellamy stepped out into the hallway. The landlady was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, pretending to polish the banister, though the cloth in her hand was dry. He walked past her down the steps and out into the evening air. The street was quiet, save for the distant rumble of a bus changing gear on the main road. He buttoned his coat against the damp chill rising from the Thames, feeling the hard edge of the envelopes against his ribs. They were not just letters, they were a map. He walked towards the station, his shoes clicking on the pavement, the rhythm steady and unyielding. The train to Bournemouth left in an hour. He would stand in the corridor if he had to, leaning against the luggage rack while the carriage swayed, reading the words of a dead man to find the living one. The shadows lengthened across the road, stretching out like fingers reaching for his ankles, but he did not look back. Victoria Station breathed coal smoke and damp wool, a thick fog that clung to the back of the throat and tasted of sulphur. Bellamy pushed through the turnstile, the ticket clipping wetly in the conductor's hand, and stepped onto the platform where the express to Bournemouth waited, a black iron beast exhaling steam against the evening sky. He did not have a seat. Petrol rationing had grounded the police cars weeks ago, leaving the roads to those with enough coupons or enough nerve to dodge the queues. so he joined the crush of civilians shoving into the third-class carriages, shoulder to shoulder, with demobilized soldiers still wearing the uniforms of a war that had ended in blood, but not in memory. Inside, the air was stagnant, heated by too many bodies and the gas lamps flickering above the racks. Bellamy wedged himself into the corridor, leaning against the luggage shelf where the metal edge dug into his spine, and let the train lurch forward with a groan of straining coupling chains. The rhythm of the wheels on the track was a constant, hammering noise, clack hiss, matching the pulse in his temples. He kept one hand inside his coat, fingers resting on the bundle of letters Mrs. Marshall had surrendered, feeling the paper soften slightly against the heat of his own body. They were evidence now, contraband. A woman in a grey utility suit stood opposite him, holding a leather bag that had seen better decades, her hat pinned precariously over hair that had turned the color of steel wool. She leaned towards her companion, a younger girl with rouge on her cheeks that was already cracking in the humidity, and lowered her voice, though not enough to escape the din of the carriage. "Paid in notes," the woman said, her words cutting through the rattle of the window pane, counted them out on the desk, didn't even ask for a receipt. The younger one shook her head, adjusting the strap of her handbag. Who carries that much coin these days, unless it's black market or worse? He said he was waiting for his wife, from the colonies. The older woman sniffed, a sharp, dismissive sound, but he ate alone, room service, twice a day, and the door was always locked. Bellamy did not move. He kept his gaze fixed on the reflection in the dark glass of the window, watching the lights of the suburbs smear into streaks of orange and grey as the train picked up speed. His hand tightened on the letters in his pocket. The description fit the pattern emerging from the London files, the same phantom officer who moved through hotels like a ghost, leaving behind unpaid bills and broken women. "Which hotel?" the younger girl asked, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking sign faded above her head. "The Norfolk Royal, room for something, perhaps 420. As the woman exhaled a plume of blue smoke that drifted towards the ceiling to join the grime already accumulated there, she added, the manager looked worried. He had said the man never unpacked, possessing just a suitcase made of good quality leather. "Did he leave?" "This morning." The woman tapped ash onto the floor, uncaring of the rule against it. "Took a taxi, didn't say where." Bellamy shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking under his shoe. The information settled in his gut like a stone. Heath was moving faster than the post, faster than the warrants could travel down the line from the Metropolitan Police to the local constabulary in Hampshire. By the time the telegram arrived in Bournemouth, the bird would have flown again, likely to France or Spain, where the extradition treaties were tangled in red tape and bribery. He needed to be there before the paper arrived. The train swayed around a bend, throwing the passengers against one another. The younger girl steadied herself on Bellamy's arm, her fingers cold through the fabric of his coat, and he nodded without looking at her, keeping his focus on the conversation that had just dried up as the women noticed his presence. They turned away, whispering behind hands that smelled of cheap powder and tobacco, suddenly aware that a man in a dark suit listening to gossip about a hotel guest might not be a fellow traveler. Bellamy closed his eyes for a second. The weariness of the last 3 years pressed down on him, the accumulated fatigue of sorting through the debris of a city that had been bombed into silence and now shouted with scandal. He wanted a cup of tea that wasn't stewed in a pot for 6 hours. He wanted a room where the window opened. He wanted to sleep without dreaming of gouge marks in wood. Instead, he had a train ride and a hunch. The journey stretched into hours, the landscape outside shifting from the dense brick of London to the open dark of the countryside, where the only light came from the moon reflecting off patches of untouched water. Bellamy stood still, conserving energy, letting the motion of the train rock him into a state of suspended alertness. He ran through the timeline in his head. Mrs. Marshall's daughter had vanished in June. The body found in Bournemouth was recent. The gap was closing, tightening like a noose around a neck that refused to admit it was strangling. At Clapham Junction, a group of soldiers boarded, laughing loudly, their boots heavy on the floor, bringing with them the smell of gin and fresh air. They filled the corridor, forcing Bellamy further back against the luggage rack, the metal biting harder into his shoulder blades. He endured it. Pain was a useful anchor, keeping him awake when the temptation to drift off was strong. When the train finally slowed for Bournemouth West, the brakes screamed, a high-pitched shriek that set teeth on edge. Bellamy pushed off the rack, stepping over the legs of a sleeping man in the corner, and made his way to the door. The platform was quieter than Victoria, the air here carrying a sharp tang of salt that cut through the coal smoke, promising a proximity to the sea that London could never offer. He stepped onto the pavement, the ground solid beneath his feet after the swaying carriage, and took a deep breath. The town was dark, blackouts still observed in patches despite the war being over, leaving the streets lit by sparse sodium lamps that cast long, distorted shadows. He checked his watch. 10 o'clock. The hotel would still have staff on duty, though the manager might be reluctant to wake them for a detective without local jurisdiction. Bellamy buttoned his coat against the sea breeze and began to walk. His shoes clicked on the pavement, the rhythm steady and unyielding, matching the beat of the train he had just left. He could feel the letters in his pocket, heavy and warm, a secret weight that demanded repayment. The Norfolk Royal was only a mile from the station, a walk he could manage without wasting coupons on a fare, and the exercise would keep the blood moving in his legs. As he walked, the buildings changed from the terraced houses of the workers to the larger, detached villas of the seaside resort, their windows dark and shuttered against the night. He passed a newsstand where the early morning editions were already being stacked, the headlines bold and screaming about the sadistic killer, even though the identification was not yet formal, the press running ahead of the law as always. He ignored them. The papers would sell the story, but they would not catch the man. The hotel loomed ahead, a red brick structure with white bay windows that looked out onto the dark expanse of the sea. A single light burned in the lobby, a beacon for late arrivals and trouble. Bellamy stopped at the corner, watching the entrance, checking for any movement in the shadows near the service door. He saw nothing. The building slept, unaware that a man who had treated murder as a sport had recently walked its halls. He crossed the street, the gravel crunching under his heels, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The bell above the frame chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that clashed with the cold intent in his chest. The clerk behind the desk looked up, startled, a pen hovering over a ledger that was open to the current date. "Can I help you, sir?" The clerk's voice was thin, wary of late-night callers who might not have the means to pay. Bellamy reached into his pocket, not for the letters, but for his warrant card, holding it up where the light could catch the gold embossing. He needed to see the room. He needed to know if the wood still held the marks of the struggle. "Inspector Bellamy, Metropolitan Police." He kept his voice low, avoiding waking the guests on the floor above. "I need to see room 421. The clerk blinked, the pen trembling slightly in his hand. "That room is occupied, or was. The guest checked out this morning." "I know." Bellamy stepped closer, the smell of the train still clinging to his clothes, mixing with the lemon polish of the desk. "I also know he left something behind, something you didn't send to lost property." The clerk's throat worked as he swallowed. He looked at the warrant card, then at Bellamy's face, and finally at the key rack behind him where a single hook stood empty. "I didn't think," the clerk started, then stopped, realizing that explanation was no longer a currency that held value here. Bellamy waited. He placed his hand on the edge of the desk, the wood smooth and cold. "The key, now." The clerk's throat worked, a dry click in the quiet lobby, but he did not reach for the key rack. He looked past Bellamy, towards the glass door where the night pressed black against the pane, and his fingers tightened around the pen until the knuckles bleached white. "Protocol requires," the clerk began, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely cleared the height of the desk, "a local officer, for entry, if the guest has checked out." Bellamy did not argue. He stepped back, leaving his hand resting on the polished wood, and lifted his chin towards the shadows near the coat stand. Constable Halloway emerged from the gloom, the peak of his cap casting a shadow over eyes that had seen too much of this war and too little of the peace that followed. He carried a heavy torch in one hand and a set of master keys in the other, the metal clinking softly against his thigh. "Metropolitan Police," Halloway said, though the uniform spoke louder than the words. "Open the door, son." The clerk flinched at the address, the authority of the local constabulary stripping away his remaining resolve. He turned to the rack, selected a brass key tagged with the number 421 and slid it across the ledger. The metal scraped against the paper, a harsh sound in the stillness. Bellamy took the key but did not move immediately. He listened to the hotel breathing around them, the creak of settling timber, the distant hum of a refrigerator motor kicking in somewhere in the kitchens, mundane sounds that made the task ahead feel more obscene. They took the lift, a cage of iron mesh that groaned as it ascended, smelling of grease and old tobacco. Bellamy watched the floor indicator dial swing from 3 to 4, the needle trembling before settling. When the gates rattled open, the corridor stretched out before them, carpeted in an Axminster pattern so busy it hid the dirt but not the wear. Room 421 stood at the far end, the wood dark and unyielding. Holloway inserted the key. It turned with a stiff reluctance, the lock unused to such late attention. Bellamy pushed the door, expecting resistance, but it swung inward on oiled hinges, revealing a sliver of darkness that smelled of stale wine and something coppery, like old pennies left in the rain. Holloway swept his torch beam across the floor, the light cutting through the dust motes dancing in the air. "Christ," the constable muttered, the word escaping before discipline could clamp it down. Bellamy stepped past him into the room. He did not switch on the main light. The torch beam was sufficient, isolating details rather than flooding the scene with false clarity. The bed dominated the space, a double with a headboard of carved mahogany. On it lay Marjorie Gardner. She was arranged rather than fallen, her limbs positioned with a deliberation that suggested a stage set prepared for an audience of one. A silk scarf bound her wrists to the iron frame, the knot precise, professional. Bellamy moved closer, his shoes sinking into the carpet. He noted the glasses on the bedside table, 2 of them, one still half full of red wine that had oxidized to the color of dried blood. The other lay shattered on the floor, shards glittering in the torchlight like scattered diamonds. He kept his hands at his sides, resisting the urge to touch the fabric of her dress, which had been pulled up to expose the torso. The marks were there, dark lines crisscrossing the skin, some healed to a bruise, others raw and weeping. They were not random strikes born of rage, but measured applications of force, spaced with an interval that implied counting. A riding crop lay on the duvet near her feet, the leather plaited and stained, placed there as if it were a tool of trade left out for inspection. "Ritualistic," Holloway said from the doorway, his voice tight. He was looking at the wall, avoiding the bed. "Punishment," Bellamy corrected. He crouched, examining the ligature marks on her ankles. There was no struggle there, no bruising from kicking against restraints. She had accepted the bind, or been convinced to accept it, before the end came. That distinction mattered. It spoke of manipulation, of a charm that could disarm a woman's instinct for self-preservation. He stood up, his knees cracking in the quiet. The air in the room was stagnant, trapped heat mixing with the scent of her perfume, a heavy floral note that was beginning to turn sour. Bellamy walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. Below, on the pavement, a car had pulled up. Men were unpacking cameras from the boot, tripods unfolding like mechanical insects. The flashbulbs popped, magnesium flares illuminating the hotel facade in brief, stark bursts of white light. "They know," Bellamy said. He let the curtain fall back into place. "Press?" Holloway asked. "Vultures." Bellamy turned away from the window, his face set in lines of exhaustion that the torchlight deepened. "They'll have heard the whisper from the staff. By morning, every rag in London will have her name. They'll print what happened here before we've even logged the evidence." He walked back to the bed, looking down at the woman who had been alive only hours before. There was no peace in her expression, only a blank surprise that suggested the end had come faster than the pain. He thought of the files in his pocket, the missing persons reports from London that had seemed so mundane compared to this. The connection was clear now, written in the language of the lash and the lie. This was not a crime of passion. It was a statement. "Secure the door," Bellamy ordered, his voice low. "No one in, not the manager, not the maid. If a reporter tries to climb the drainpipe, throw him off." Holloway nodded, stepping out into the corridor to stand guard. The door clicked shut, leaving Bellamy alone with the dead. He stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the hotel, the distant sea breeze rattling the sash window. He felt the weight of the investigation settling on his shoulders, heavier than the greatcoat he wore. This room was a crime scene, but it was also a message sent from a man who believed he was untouchable. Bellamy took out his notebook and a pencil, the lead scratching against the paper as he began to list the items on the bedside table. He would not let the chaos outside contaminate the truth inside. He wrote down the brand of the wine, the type of knot on the scarf, the specific pattern of the bruises. Each detail was a brick in the wall he would build around the killer. Outside, another flashbulb popped, a bright pulse of light leaking through the curtains to wash over the body on the bed. Bellamy did not look up. He kept writing, the pencil moving steadily, anchoring himself to the facts while the world outside began to scream. The killer was gone, vanished into the night, but the paper trail remained. It always did. Men like him left marks on more than just flesh. Bellamy closed the notebook and slipped it into his pocket. He needed to get the pathologist down here before the rigor mortis set in completely, before the heat of the room altered the chemistry of the blood. He walked to the door, his hand on the latch, and paused. He looked back at the bed one last time, committing the arrangement to memory. The whip lay across the duvet, a dark line against the white linen. It looked less like a weapon and more like a signature. He opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, where Holloway was waiting with the telephone receiver in hand. "London on the wire," Holloway said, his face pale in the dim hallway light. "They've found something in the registry," the name he gave. Bellamy took the receiver, the Bakelite cold against his ear. He listened to the voice on the other end, a crackling transmission distorted by distance and poor lines. The words were clear enough. The name was a lie. The man was already gone. "Put the phone down," Bellamy said, handing the receiver back to Holloway. He started towards the stairs, his stride lengthening. "We're not chasing a ghost. We're chasing a man who buys wine and leaves receipts." Bellamy's shoe heel clicked on the top stair, a sharp sound swallowed by the runner. He did not go down. A man in a grey suit was coming up, carrying a black bag that looked heavy enough to dislocate a shoulder. "Jenkins," the man said. He did not offer a hand. His breath smelled of peppermint and stale tobacco. "They tell me there's a woman in Fort 21. "Marjorie Gardner." Bellamy stepped aside to let him pass, the corridor narrow as a coffin. "She's been there since morning. Heat's doing its work." Jenkins paused, one hand on the door latch of room 421. He looked at Bellamy, then at the uniformed constable guarding the threshold, his face the color of wet plaster. "I'll need an hour," Jenkins said. "Maybe two, the light's failing." "Give me what you can now." "Blood coagulation, rigor." Jenkins turned the handle. "The rest, the chemical tests for time of death, you'll wait a fortnight. The reagents aren't here. They're in London, and London isn't sending anything down the line until Monday." He pushed the door open and vanished into the gloom. Bellamy leaned against the wall, the plaster rough against his coat sleeve. He closed his eyes for a second, just a second, letting the darkness behind his lids block out the flickering sconce above his head. The heat in the corridor was worse than in the room, trapped by the closed windows and the press of bodies. He could hear the murmur of voices from the street below, a distant roar like the sea breaking against shingle. A cart rattled towards him, wood on linoleum. A maid pushed it, her head down, apron starched stiff against her chest. She tried to steer around Bellamy, wheels squeaking, but he put a hand on the handle. She flinched. "Name." Elsie Vane." She kept her eyes on the floor, on the scuff marks near the skirting board. "I've got linen to change," the manager said her. "The manager isn't here." Bellamy kept his hand on the cart. It smelled of lavender soap and damp rags. "You were on this floor this morning." 6 to 2. Room 421. Elsie's throat worked. She swallowed, a visible click of muscle under the skin. She looked at the door where Jenkins had disappeared, then back at Bellamy. Her hands were red from hot water, knuckles swollen. "I didn't see nothing," she said, "too quick." "You saw him lave." It wasn't a question. Elsie glanced left, then right, as if the walls had ears. The corridor was empty save for them and the constable, who was staring at his boots. "He came out just after 10, she whispered. The words barely carried over the hum of the light fixture. "He had a case," small, leather. Description: grey suit like the doctor. She hesitated, biting her lower lip until it turned white. He wore a raincoat, Macintosh, buttoned to the top. Bellamy frowned. The air in the corridor was stifling, thick enough to chew. Outside, the summer sun was baking the pavement, yet this man wore wool and rubber. It was warm, Elsie said, reading his expression. I thought he was ill, or hiding something under it. Which way? Stairs, not the lift. She pulled the cart back an inch. Please, I've got children, if the papers say I spoke here. They won't have your name. Bellamy released the handle. Go. She pushed the cart past him, wheels whining, and did not look back. Bellamy watched her disappear around the bend towards the service lift, her shoulders hunched against the air itself. A raincoat in July. Either the man was feverish, or he was carrying something that needed concealment beyond the usual shame of a hurried departure. Weapons, clothes stained with wine, or the tools of a trade he hadn't yet finished practicing. He turned back to the room. Jenkins was standing over the body, a magnifying glass in one hand, a notebook in the other. He did not look up when Bellamy entered. Ligature marks on the wrists, Jenkins said. Consensual initially, no defensive bruising on the forearms. She let him tie her. And the end. Single lash. Jenkins straightened, his spine cracking audibly, severed the brachial artery. She bled out while he watched. He closed the notebook with a snap. It's surgical, precise. This wasn't a loss of temper, detective. It was an execution. Bellamy nodded. He had known. Knowing it and proving it were two different countries, separated by an ocean of bureaucracy and missing forms. He walked to the window again. The flashbulbs below were constant now, a strobe effect against the darkening sky. They were printing the extras as he stood there. Sadistic killer, hotel horror. The words would be set in lead before the body was cold. Keep her here until Monday, Bellamy said. Don't let the coroner rush you. I can't hold her forever. Until I have the report. Jenkins tucked the glass into his pocket. He looked tired, the skin under his eyes bruised with exhaustion. You think there are more? I think he didn't stop with her. Jenkins left, the door clicking shut behind him. Bellamy remained. He walked to the bedside table and picked up one of the wine glasses. It was empty, a ring of red stain at the bottom. He set it down gently. Every object in this room was a witness, silent and stubborn. He had to make them speak. He went out into the corridor. Holloway was still there, but the telephone receiver was no longer in his hand. Instead, a yellow slip of paper lay on the small table by the stairs. A telegram. From the yard, Holloway said. He didn't pick it up. Came while you were with the maid. Bellamy took the paper. The ink was fresh, smudged slightly where the telegraph boy's thumb had pressed. Group Captain BROKE confirmed, posted, India, June 1945, stop alias stop. The paper crinkled in his grip. He folded it once, twice, until it was a small square of hard pressure in his palm. The name on the register was a ghost. The man in the raincoat was already miles away, moving through the shadows of a city that was too tired to look closely at a man in a uniform, even a fake one. Book me a train, Bellamy said. He handed the telegram back to Holloway. London, night service. So, he's not in Bournemouth. Bellamy started down the stairs, his hand trailing along the banister, feeling the varnish worn smooth by 1,000 grasping hands. He's going back to where he started, to the women who haven't gone missing yet. The front door of the hotel was propped open, a wedge of wood holding it against the flow of reporters. Bellamy pushed through the gap, ignoring the shouts. The questions barked like commands. He stepped onto the pavement. The air outside was cooler, carrying the salt tang of the sea and the exhaust fumes of idling engines. A camera flashed, blinding him for a second. He did not blink. He walked towards the rank where the taxis waited, their drivers smoking in the gloom, watching him with the weary eyes of men who knew that trouble always paid the fare. The taxi driver did not ask for a destination. He saw the cut of Bellamy's suit, the grey fatigue settling into the shoulders, and lit the meter with a thumb that smelled of stale tobacco and grease. Victoria, Bellamy said. The word felt heavy, dropping into the quiet cab like a stone into a well, and drive as if the war is still on. The engine coughed, a wet, struggling sound, before catching hold. They pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching over shards of glass that glittered in the streetlight like discarded diamonds. Behind them, the Norfolk Royale receded, its windows darkening one by one as guests drew the curtains against the spectacle. The flashbulbs ceased their strobing, replaced by the low murmur of men shouting deadlines to copy boys who were already running towards the telegraph office, their shoes slapping against the wet pavement. Bellamy leaned back into the seat. The leather was cracked, stuffing bursting from a tear near the armrest, and the smell of the car was a cloying mix of damp wool and burnt oil. He closed his eyes, but the image of Marjorie Gardner did not fade, it sharpened. The precise arrangement of the limbs, the theatricality of the wine glasses, the whip laid out like a conductor's baton. It was not a crime of passion. Passion was messy, hurried, a thing of broken nails and torn fabric. This was a performance. A man who believed he was directing a play where he held the only script. The taxi hit a pothole, jarring his spine. He opened his eyes. Outside, the blackout curtains were still up in most houses, strips of light leaking through the edges where fabric had warped or shrunk. 6 months since VE Day, and the habit of hiding remained ingrained in the brickwork. People trusted the dark more than the light. In the dark, you could not see the ration books, the mended socks, the hollows in a child's cheek. In the dark, a man in a raincoat could walk past a policeman and not be seen at all. Heat, Bellamy muttered. The name tasted of copper. Sorry, Gov, the driver glanced in the mirror. His eyes were pale, watery. Nothing, keep moving. The city rushed past, a blur of shadow and brick. Bournemouth was a transient place, a seaside town trying to remember how to be a resort when the sea was cold and the pier was half demolished. But London waited. London was where the files were, where the missing persons reports sat in piles on desks that had not been cleared since 1940. Doreen Marshall, others whose names had not yet been linked, whose families were still waiting for letters that would never come. They were out there, walking the same streets, trusting the same uniforms, the same polished shoes. He reached into his pocket and touched the telegram. The paper was soft now, the ink smudged further by the sweat of his palm. Alias. The word was a legal technicality, a bureaucratic shrug. To Bellamy, it was a door slamming shut. The real group Captain Brooke was in India, sweating in a uniform that belonged to him, unaware that his identity was being used to strangle women in hotel rooms on the south coast. The impersonation was not just a disguise, it was a weapon. It exploited the deference that was still owed to men who had worn the king's cloth, even if the cloth was stolen. The taxi slowed for a junction. A tram clattered past, sparks flying from the overhead wire, illuminating the face of a woman waiting at the stop. She looked tired, her head bowed against the wind, a string bag dangling from her wrist containing nothing but a loaf of bread wrapped in newspaper. She did not look up as the car passed. No one looked up anymore. They kept their eyes on the ground, watching for rubble, for cues, for the next thing that would be taken away. Bellamy felt a sudden, sharp anger rise in his chest. It was not directed at the driver, or the traffic, or the slow crawl towards the station. It was directed at the silence of the victims who could not speak, the silence of the witnesses who were too afraid to talk, the silence of a system that moved so slowly it allowed a monster to board a train and vanish before the warrant could be typed. "We'll make the 9:15 if the signals are kind," the driver said. He tapped the dashboard as if the car could hear him. "Train's full, though, demob boys coming home, half of them drunk, the other half looking for a fight. Just get me there." The station loomed ahead, a cathedral of soot and steam. The archway was blackened by decades of coal smoke, the iron girders rusting where the paint had peeled away. Inside, the concourse was a chaos of noise and movement. Porters shouted over the din of whistles and slamming doors. Soldiers in ill-fitting civilian clothes dragged suitcases bound with string. Women clutched children and parcels, their faces set in masks of determined exhaustion. Bellamy pushed through the crowd, his badge held high but barely noticed. In the crush, everyone was someone else's obstacle. He reached the ticket office, the queue snaking back towards the entrance. He did not join it. He leaned over the counter, catching the eye of the clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and glasses that slid down his nose. Inspector Bellamy, CID. He placed his badge on the ledge. I need a ticket to Victoria, immediate departure. The clerk blinked. He looked at the badge, then at the line of people behind Bellamy, then back. All reserved, sir. Standing room only on the 9:15. Even then, it's tight. I don't care if I have to sit on the cold tender. Get me on that train. The clerk hesitated, his mouth opening to protest the protocol, the rules that govern the rationing of seats as strictly as the rationing of sugar. Then he saw Bellamy's eyes. The weariness there was not just fatigue, it was a kind of gravity pulling at the air between them. The clerk swallowed, nodded, and turned to the board behind him. He scribbled something on a form, stamped it with a heavy thud, and slid a ticket across the counter. Platform 4, 5 minutes. Bellamy took the ticket. Thank you. He turned away, the paper crisp in his hand. The station clock ticked above him, the second hand sweeping round with a mechanical indifference that matched the rhythm of the city. Time was moving forward, relentless and uncaring. Somewhere, a man in a raincoat was buying a ticket too, or perhaps he was already on the train, sitting in a corner, buttoned up against the heat, waiting for the shadows to lengthen again. Bellamy started towards the platform, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of the instinctive recognition of purpose. He was moving towards something while they were just waiting. He reached the edge of the platform, the steam from the engine billowing around him, thick and yellow. The train hissed, a great beast breathing in the night. He climbed the steps, the metal grating vibrating under his feet. Inside the carriage, the air was stale, thick with the smell of wet coats and human sweat. He found a space by the window, pressing himself against the glass as others jostled past, seeking seats, seeking home. He did not sit. He stood, watching the platform through the grimy pane. A porter waved a green flag. The whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that cut through the noise of the station. The train lurched forward, the wheels grinding against the tracks. Bellamy watched the station recede, the lights blurring into streaks of orange and white. He was leaving Bournemouth, leaving the body, leaving the scene of the crime, but he was not leaving the case. It was inside him now, a cold weight in his gut, heavier than the suitcase he had not brought. The train picked up speed, the rhythm of the wheels becoming a steady, pounding beat. Clack, 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 clack. It sounded like a countdown. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watching the darkness rush past. London was waiting, and somewhere in that sprawling, broken city, Neville Heath was smiling, thinking he had slipped the noose. He had not yet. Bellamy reached into his pocket again, his fingers brushing against the notebook where he had written Elsie's description. Raincoat, grey suit, small case. He pulled it out, opening it to a fresh page. The pencil hovered over the paper. He did not write immediately. He watched his own reflection in the window, ghostly and superimposed over the fleeing landscape. He thinks he's invisible, Bellamy whispered to the glass. He thinks the uniform makes him a ghost. He pressed the pencil down, the lead scratching against the page, leaving a dark, permanent mark. But ghosts leave traces. The train plunged into a tunnel, the reflection vanishing, replaced by total darkness. In the blackness, the only sound was the roar of the wheels and the steady, unyielding scratch of the pencil, writing a name that would soon be screamed from every newsstand in England. The pen scratched across the page, a dry, rasping sound that filled the small room where the wallpaper peeled in long, sun-bleached strips. Neville Heath did not look up as the landlady knocked, her knuckles rapping against the wood, with a timidity that suggested she feared disturbing a superior officer more than she feared the rent being late. Tea, Colonel, or perhaps something stronger. He capped the fountain pen, the gold nib clicking shut with a finality that seemed to seal the room in amber. No, Mrs. Gable, I have work to attend to, official correspondence. He kept his voice level, imbuing the lie with the bored authority of a man accustomed to having his whims treated as orders. The woman hesitated in the hallway, her silhouette framed by the dim bulb that burned behind her, before the deference won out and her footsteps retreated down the creaking stairs. Heath waited until the silence returned, thick and dust-laden, before allowing the corner of his mouth to twitch upwards. It was a game of seconds, this dance between counties, and he was leading. The Metropolitan Police could not touch him here, not without a piece of paper, travelling by rail from London to Bournemouth, a journey that would take the better part of 2 days while he sat in a chair that smelled of mothballs and old tobacco. He picked up the sheet of paper he had just filled, the ink still glistening wetly under the single bare bulb, and read his own handwriting. The script was elegant, looping with a flourish that suggested education and breeding, entirely at odds with the brutality of the thoughts it concealed. "My dear Elena," he had written, "the countryside offers a respite one hardly expects in such turbulent times, though the locals remain tragically insular regarding matters of national security." It was charming, it was innocent, it was a masterpiece of omission that would serve as an alibi should anyone care to ask where he had been on the evening Marjorie Gardner stopped breathing. He folded the letter carefully, aligning the edges with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, before sliding it into an envelope addressed to a woman in Kensington who knew nothing of bloodstains or lash marks. She would receive it in 3 days, by which time he intended to be nowhere near any address the post office could deliver to. He stood stretching his arms above his head until his spine cracked, a sharp report that echoed in the cramped space. The uniform jacket hung on the back of the door, the fabric heavy and dark, bearing the insignia of a rank he had never earned but wore with more conviction than those who had. He ran a hand over the shoulder, smoothing a non-existent crease, feeling the weight of the wool against his palm. It was a shield, this cloth, more effective than any wall of stone or iron. People saw the badges, the braid, the cut of the lapels, and their eyes glazed over with a conditioned obedience that made them blind to the man underneath. He tucked the envelope into his inner pocket, patting it twice to ensure it was secure, then grabbed his cap from the dresser. The mirror above the basin showed a face that was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, the eyes bright with a vitality that the war had extinguished in so many others. He did not see a killer looking back. He saw an artist, a conductor of chaos in an orchestra of fools. Stepping out into the night, the air hit him with a damp chill that carried the scent of coal smoke and wet pavement. The blackout curtains were drawn tight in every window along the street, turning the town into a canyon of shadows where the only light came from the occasional beam of a torch or the glow of a cigarette end cupped in a shaking hand. Heath walked with a purposeful stride, his boots clicking rhythmically against the flagstones, the sound asserting his presence in the darkness. He passed a group of men standing outside a pub, their voices low and muttered as they discussed the shortages, the queues, the endless waiting that defined their lives. They fell silent as he approached, stepping aside to let him pass, their heads dipping slightly in an unconscious gesture of respect. He did not acknowledge them, keeping his gaze fixed forward, but he felt their deference like a physical warmth against his skin. It was intoxicating, this power, derived not from strength or virtue, but from the simple act of wearing the right costume in a world desperate for order. The town itself bore the scars of the Blitz, gaps in the terraced rows where bombs had fallen, leaving jagged teeth of brick and twisted iron poking out from the rubble like broken bones. Heath paused at the edge of one such site, looking down into the pit where weeds had begun to reclaim the destruction, twisting through the debris with a tenacious green life. There was a beauty in it, he thought, a kind of honest ruin that matched the landscape inside his own head. The war had taught them all that everything was fragile, that civility was just a thin veneer over the savagery beneath, and he was merely the one willing to peel it back. He continued walking, turning a corner towards the high street where a tailor's shop still kept late hours for those with the means to pay cash. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, a bright, cheerful sound that clashed with the gloom outside. The tailor, a small man with thimbles on his fingers and spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from his cutting table. His eyes widened slightly as he registered the uniform, the posture, the air of command that filled the small space. "Good evening, sir. How can I be of service?" "The trousers," Heath said, his voice cutting through the smell of steam and pressing oil. "They require a slight adjustment. The crease is not quite regulation." "Of course, Colonel, immediately." The tailor bustled forward, his hands fluttering nervously as he reached for the measuring tape. "We do so appreciate your service, truly." Heath smiled, a cold expression that did not reach his eyes, and allowed the man to fuss over the hem of his trousers. He watched the tailor's bowed head, the graying hair, the trembling hands that worked with such desperate care, and felt a surge of contempt so pure it almost tasted like bile. These people would rebuild their cities, queue for their rations, and pray for their sons to come home, all while men like him walked among them, wearing their trust like a cloak. The alteration took 10 minutes. Heath paid in crisp banknotes, money that had come from selling watches that no longer belonged to him, and the tailor accepted it with a gratitude that was painful to witness. "Thank you, sir. God bless you." "See that you do," Heath replied, turning on his heel and stepping back out into the night. He walked briskly now, the adjusted uniform fitting perfectly, the fabric moving with him as if it were part of his own skin. He needed to find a newsagent before they closed, to gauge the temperature of the hunt, to see how close the hounds were getting. He turned down a side street, the shadows lengthening around him, and spotted the glow of a kiosk still open at the corner. He bought an evening paper, tossing a coin to the vendor who barely looked up from his newspaper. Heath unfolded the sheet under the glare of a street lamp, the headlines screaming up at him in bold, black ink. "Sadistic killer on the loose. Police baffled by Bournemouth horror." Description circulated nationwide. His finger traced the column of text, scanning for his own description, for the details that might link the charming colonel to the body in room 421. The article was vague, reliant on witness statements that were already growing distorted by fear and speculation, but there was enough there to make his pulse quicken. They were closer than he had anticipated. The press was moving faster than the post, collapsing the distance between his crimes and his capture, turning the entire country into a net that was tightening with every passing hour. He folded the paper sharply, the sound cracking like a pistol shot in the quiet street. The game had changed. The leisurely pace of the last few days was over, replaced by an urgency that demanded immediate action. He could not stay here, not with the eyes of the nation suddenly focused on the south coast. He needed to move, to vanish into the sprawl of London or perhaps further north, where the fog was thicker and the memories shorter. He tucked the newspaper under his arm and began to walk faster, his boots striking the pavement with a new, urgent rhythm. The noose was not yet around his neck, but he could feel the rope brushing against his skin, whispering promises of an end that he had no intention of meeting. Not tonight, not while there was still so much left to do. The inkwell sat on the writing table, a squat glass pot filled with fluid so dark it seemed to swallow the light from the single bulb overhead. Heath dipped the nib, watching the black liquid cling to the steel before he lowered it to the cream-colored paper, the scratch of the point against the fiber sounding loud in the quiet room. He wrote with a looping, elegant hand, the kind of script taught in preparatory schools to boys destined for command, forming letters that betrayed nothing of the rot beneath. "My dearest Clara," he began, the words flowing easily, a stream of charming fabrication designed to land on a doormat in Kensington 3 days hence. "The air down here is thick with salt and memory, reminding me constantly of our walks along the embankment before the world decided to lose its mind." He paused, lifting the pen to let the ink dry, his eyes sweeping across the sentence for any hook upon which a censor might hang a suspicion. It was clean, innocuous, the rambling of a lonely officer seeking connection in a fractured land, yet every adjective served a purpose, weaving a narrative of respectability that would act as an alibi should the authorities come knocking. He described the hotel food as meager but adequate, a lie that aligned perfectly with the national mood of make do and mend, and mentioned a planned excursion to London to visit a tailor, a truth twisted just enough to mislead. "One finds that uniform opens doors even when the pockets are light," he wrote, the nib digging slightly deeper into the paper, leaving a faint indentation that would remain long after the words were read. "It is a strange comfort, is it not, to be recognized for what one represents rather than who one is." He signed it with a flourish, George's, a name that felt suitably continental and vague, then folded the sheet into a precise triangle before sliding it into an envelope he had purchased from a stationer who asked no questions. The smell of the glue was sharp, chemical and cloying, sticking to his fingers as he sealed the flap, a tactile reminder of the bond he was forging with a woman who believed him to be a hero. He placed the letter on top of his kit bag, ready for the morning post, knowing that by the time it arrived, he would be nowhere near the address written in the corner. Standing up, he stretched, the joints in his spine clicking softly, a dry sound like twigs snapping underfoot. The room was small, the wallpaper peeling in strips that hung like dead skin, revealing the grey plaster beneath, but it served its purpose as a waypoint, a temporary shell to be shed once the heat rose. He walked to the window, pulling the heavy blackout curtain aside just enough to peer out, the glass cold against his fingertips despite the warmth of the summer night. Below, the street lay in a pool of orange gloom cast by a solitary lamp that had escaped the strictures of the blackout, illuminating the rubble of a bombed shopfront across the way. Bricks were stacked in neat piles where a wall had once stood, moss growing in the mortar joints, nature already beginning the work of reclamation that men would take decades to complete. Heath watched a stray dog pick its way through the debris, ribs showing through its matted fur, stopping to sniff at a discarded tin before moving on with a limp. There was a kinship there, he decided, between the broken building and the broken people, a shared understanding that survival was merely a matter of enduring the next blow. The war had stripped away the pretense of civility, revealing the raw, jagged edges of human nature, and he felt more alive in this ruin than he ever had in the polished drawing rooms of peacetime London. While others mourned the loss of order, he celebrated the freedom of the chaos, the ability to move through the cracks where the light did not reach. He turned from the window, leaving the curtain slightly askew, and picked up his cap, smoothing the peak with a palm that felt dry and hot. The uniform sat perfectly on his shoulders now, the tailor's work invisible, the fabric falling in lines that suggested authority and discipline. He checked his reflection in the small mirror above the washbasin, adjusting the tie until the knot sat just so, a mask of respectability that hid the predator beneath. Stepping out into the corridor, the floorboards creaked under his boots, the sound echoing in the narrow space like a warning shot. The guest house was silent, the other guests asleep behind their thin doors, trusting in the locks and the laws that kept the darkness at bay. He descended the stairs, taking them two at a time, the banister rough under his hand, wood worn smooth by the grip of 100 anxious travelers. The night air outside hit him like a physical blow, heavy with the scent of coal smoke and damp dust, the taste of it settling on the back of his tongue. He walked with purpose now, his stride lengthening, the urgency of the newspaper headline driving him forward through the shadowed streets. The town felt different in the dark, the familiar landmarks transformed into looming shapes that seemed to watch him pass, silent judges in a court of one. He needed to put distance between himself and this place, to melt into the anonymity of the rail network, before the dawn brought the scrutiny of local constables who might have read the papers. The jurisdictional lag was his shield, a 48-hour gap in the armor of the law where he could exist without a name, but shields could be pierced if one stayed in the line of fire too long. He turned a corner, his boots striking the pavement with a rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart, fast and hard and unafraid. A church clock chimed the hour, the sound bronze and hollow, vibrating through the stillness of the street. 10 o'clock. The trains would be few now, the schedules reduced by the austerity of the times, but there would be enough to carry him away if he moved quickly. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the remaining banknotes, the paper soft and worn from circulation, a tangible measure of the lives he had trimmed to fund his flight. Ahead, the silhouette of the station loomed against the sky, a dark hulk of iron and brick that promised escape. He quickened his pace, the wind picking up, tugging at the hem of his tunic, carrying with it the distant wail of a siren from a factory shift change. The sound grated on his nerves, a reminder of the machinery of society that continued to grind on regardless of the monsters walking among them. He approached the ticket office, the window lit by a single bare bulb, the glass smeared with the grime of 1,000 unwashed hands. The clerk inside looked up, his face pale and tired, eyes rimmed with red from the long shift. "Where to, sir?" "London," Heath said, his voice smooth, devoid of hesitation. "First class, next available." The clerk nodded, turning to the board behind him, checking the times with a sluggish finger. 10:45, platform 3, you'll have to be sharp." "I am always sharp," Heath replied, placing the money on the counter, the notes crisp and white against the dark wood. The clerk took the fare, counting it slowly, his movements deliberate and painfully human. He handed over the ticket, a small slip of cardboard that felt insignificant in Heath's hand, yet held the weight of his freedom. "Mind the gap," the clerk murmured, already looking past him to the empty queue behind. Heath turned away, pocketing the ticket, and walked towards the platform, the darkness swallowing him whole. The train waited, a beast of steam and steel, puffing softly in the night, ready to carry him back into the heart of the maze. He climbed the steps, the metal cold under his palm, and found a compartment in the rear, sliding the door shut behind him with a definitive click. Sitting back against the velvet seat, he watched the station platform slide away as the train began to move, the wheels clattering over the points, a rhythmic drumming that sounded like applause. The lights of the town faded, replaced by the black void of the countryside, the windows reflecting his own face back at him, smiling in the gloom. He was gone, vanished into the seam between the counties, leaving only a letter and a memory in his wake. But the paper in his pocket felt heavy, a constant weight against his thigh, reminding him that the net was wider than he had thought. The press had wings, and they were flying faster than the rails could carry him. He touched the folded sheet through the fabric of his trousers, feeling the sharp crease, the potential for disaster tucked away against his skin. The train picked up speed, the carriage swaying gently, the rhythm lulling him into a false sense of security. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the whistle blow, a long, mournful sound that echoed across the fields. It was a good sound, a sound of movement, of progress, of a man staying one step ahead of the grave. Yet in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that the game was changing, that the rules he had relied upon were being rewritten by ink and sensation. He opened his eyes, staring into the dark glass, watching his reflection blur as the speed increased. The noose was tightening, not around his neck, but around the space in which he could breathe, compressing the world until there was nowhere left to run. He reached for the newspaper again, pulling it from his pocket, the pages rustling loudly in the empty compartment. The headlines stared back at him, the bold letters seeming to grow larger, more accusatory in the dim light. "Sadistic killer." The words danced before his eyes, mocking his calm, his composure, his belief in his own invincibility. He crushed the paper in his fist, the sound tearing through the silence, a violent act that left his knuckles white. The train hurtled on, carrying him towards London, towards the trap, towards the end that he refused to acknowledge. The wheels screamed against the tracks, a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge, a sonic warning that he chose to ignore. Outside, the countryside rushed by, a blur of shadow and moonlight, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the carriage. Heath sat still, the crumpled newspaper in his hand, his mind racing faster than the train, calculating odds, assessing risks, planning the next move in a game that was suddenly slipping from his control. The charm was still there, the uniform still fit, but the air had changed, grown thin and difficult to breathe. He looked at his watch, the luminous hands glowing green in the dark, marking the seconds as they ticked away, each one a step closer to the morning, to the discovery, to the hunt. Time was no longer his ally. It was a creditor demanding payment, and the debt was coming due. He tucked the watch away, straightening his cuffs, preparing himself for the arrival, for the city that waited with its eyes open and its teeth bared. The train slowed, the brakes squealing, the momentum shifting as the outskirts of London approached, a sprawl of darkness punctuated by the occasional flare of a street lamp. Heath stood up, smoothing his tunic, checking his reflection one last time in the darkened window. The face looking back was calm, composed, the face of a colonel, a gentleman, a hero. It was a lie, but it was the only weapon he had left. He opened the compartment door, stepping out into the corridor as the train ground to a halt, the silence of the station waiting to swallow him whole. He took a deep breath, the air stale and recycled, and stepped onto the platform, into the crowd, into the danger. The game was over, the hunt had begun, and he was the prey. The platform at Victoria smelled of wet coal, and the sour, sweet rot of overripe bananas left too long in the heat. Heath stepped off the carriage, his boot finding the gap between the train and the concrete with practiced ease, the iron heel clicking a sharp, solitary note against the din of arriving passengers. He did not rush. Rushing was for the frightened, for the men with holes in their socks and anxiety in their gut. not for a colonel of His Majesty's forces returning from duty. A porter eyed him, cap pulled low against the glare of the station lights, waiting for a tip that would not come. "Drunk, sir." "I travel light," Heath said, brushing past the man, the fabric of his tunic whispering against the porter's grimy apron. "Essential only." He moved through the crowd, a shark slipping through a school of frantic minnows, the sheer volume of humanity parting before the authority of the uniform. The air inside the station hung heavy, a soup of steam and exhausted breath pressing against the back of his throat. Somewhere, a child cried, a thin, wailing sound that cut through the announcement of delayed trains, but Heath did not flinch. He adjusted his collar, feeling the stiff starch bite into his neck, a comforting restriction that reminded him of who he was supposed to be. The streets outside offered no relief from the oppressive warmth of the summer night. London breathed out, exhaling the day's accumulated heat from the brickwork, the pavement radiating a stored fever that clung to the soles of his shoes. Blackout curtains remained drawn in most windows, strips of darkness cutting across the facades like blindfolds on a city that refused to see its own scars. Rubble piles sat on corners, fenced off with splintered wood, monuments to a war that had ended but refused to leave. He turned down a side street, the noise of the main road fading into a muffled hum. Here the damage was more intimate. A house stood gutted, its ribs of joists exposed to the moon, looking less like a building and more like a carcass picked clean by scavengers. Heath stopped, tilting his head to examine the destruction, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. It was beautiful in a way. The chaos was honest. It stripped away the pretense of order, revealing the fragile scaffolding beneath society's polite veneer. He felt a kinship with the ruin. Just as the bomb did not care for the distinction between the innocent and the guilty, neither did he. Violence was simply a force of nature, a rearrangement of matter that left the world more interesting than it had been before. "Careful there, Governor." A voice from the shadows, rough with tobacco and suspicion. A warden stepped out, armband white in the gloom, torch beam cutting a shaky cone through the dust. "The pavement's uneven, been that way since '44. "Thank you," Heath replied, his tone dripping with the languid grace of the officer class, the kind of voice that made civilians instinctively step aside. "I shall navigate with due caution." The warden hesitated, the torch dipping slightly as the man registered the rows of ribbons on Heath's chest, the medals that glittered with unearned virtue. The deference kicked in, automatic and deep-rooted, a reflex honed by 6 years of conflict. "Right you are, sir, just watch your step." "Always." Heath walked on, leaving the warden standing in the dust, the man's authority dissolving before the weight of the costume. The cash in his pocket burned, a heavy stack of notes liberated from a handbag in a left luggage office, enough to buy silence and alteration. He needed the uniform to fit perfectly, to sit on his shoulders with the exact drape of command. Imperfection was a crack in the armor, and cracks let the light in. The tailor's shop was tucked between a bombed-out bakery and a shuttered newsagent, a narrow slit of a premises with a single light burning behind frosted glass. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful, anachronistic sound that seemed out of place in the somber street. Inside, the air smelled of mothballs and hot wool, a dry, prickly scent that coated the tongue. Mr. Gable looked up from his cutting table, spectacles sliding down a nose dusted with chalk. He was a small man, shrunk by the rationing that had pared the flesh from his bones, leaving him sharp and angular as a bird. "Closed," Gable said, though he did not move to enforce it. His eyes lingered on the uniform, tracing the lines of the tunic with a mixture of envy and resentment. "Unless your emergency." "I require an adjustment," Heath said, stepping further into the room, letting the door swing shut behind him. The silence of the shop settled around them, thick and expectant. "The shoulders are too narrow, it impedes movement." Gable stood, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "Fabric is scarce, Colonel. I can't let out what isn't there." "I have my own material." Heath reached into his bag, pulling out a length of dark cloth, high quality, stolen from a department store in Bournemouth, along with the rest of the ensemble. He laid it on the counter, the texture rich and smooth under the dim bulb. And I have cash, full price, no coupons. The mention of cash shifted the atmosphere instantly. Gable's posture softened, the rigid spine of the rationed citizen bending before the golden calf of the black market. He touched the fabric, rubbing it between thumb and forefinger, checking the weave. Fine wool, the tailor murmured, more to himself than to Heath. Very fine. Can you do it? Tonight, Gable looked at the clock on the wall, its ticking loud in the quiet room. It will take an hour, maybe two, the stitching must be invisible. I have time. Heath leaned against the counter, crossing his ankles, projecting an infinite patience that he did not feel. I will wait. Gable nodded, already measuring, his fingers flying over Heath's shoulders with a professional intimacy that bordered on the invasive. The tape measure snapped, a sharp sound like a whip crack. Arms up, sir. Heath complied, staring at his reflection in the tall mirror behind the counter. The man looking back was a stranger, a construct of cloth and brass, a hero fabricated from the grief of a nation. He watched Gable work, the needle flashing in the low light, sewing him tighter into the lie. It was a ritual, this dressing up, a preparation for a performance that demanded absolute conviction. You served long, sir? Gable asked, his mouth full of pins, the words muffled. Long enough, Heath said, his eyes fixed on his own reflection, on the coldness in the pupils. Long enough to know what men are capable of. Ah, Gable pulled a pin free, biting the thread. We all know that now, don't we? The world's gone mad. Has it? Heath turned slightly, allowing the tailor access to the back. Or has it just stopped pretending? Gable paused, needle hovering, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he buried it in the work. Just a figure of speech, sir, best not to dwell. Quite. The minutes stretched, filled only by the rhythmic pull of the thread and the distant rumble of a lorry on the main road. Heath let his mind drift, rehearsing the next steps, the aliases, the routes south to the coast. He would need a boat, a pilot, something to carry him across the channel before the net tightened completely. The letter in his pocket felt lighter now, the burden transferred to the needle and thread binding him into this shell. When it was done, Gable stepped back, wiping his brow with a trembling hand. Try it, move around. Heath shrugged the tunic on, rolling his shoulders. The fit was perfect, the new panels seamless, the silhouette broad and commanding. He looked like a man who could order an execution without blinking. Excellent, Heath said, placing the wad of notes on the counter. The money looked obscene against the grey dust of the shop. Keep the change. Gable stared at the notes, then at Heath, a complex emotion twisting his features: gratitude, shame, fear. Thank you, sir. Safe journey. Good night, Mr. Gable. Heath walked out into the street, the new uniform settling around him like a second skin, cool and reassuring. The night had deepened, the shadows longer, the city holding its breath. He reached into his pocket, not for the letter this time, but for the evening paper he had rescued from a bin near the station. He smoothed the crumpled page under the glow of a street lamp, the ink still stark against the newsprint. The headlines screamed up at him, larger than before, the typesetter's panic evident in the jagged edges of the letters. Sadistic killer on the loose. Below it, a sketch, a rough likeness, but unmistakably him. The description listed his height, his build, his penchant for military affectation. The blood in his veins did not freeze, it accelerated, pumping a hot, electric current through his limbs. They were faster than he had calculated. The press had turned the bureaucracy into a sieve, pouring his image into every crevice of the country before the requisition forms could even be stamped. He folded the paper slowly, precisely, tucking it back into his pocket. The game had shifted. The leisurely stroll was over, the sprint had begun. He looked up the street, towards the darkness where the trains to the coast waited, and began to walk, his steps quickening, the rhythm of the hunt now firmly in his ears. The match head flared, a sudden sulfur bloom that strung Alina's nostrils before she crushed it against the ashtray's rim. Smoke curled up, grey and lazy, joining the haze that already clung to the ceiling of her tiny bedsit, a permanent fixture like the damp patch spreading behind the wardrobe. She held the bundle of letters over the flame, her hand steady until the heat licked her fingertips, forcing a reflexive jerk that nearly dropped the paper onto the threadbare rug. Burn them. The thought was a drumbeat, relentless and terrified. If they existed, she existed in them. If they burned, the weekend in Hastings never happened, and she remained a girl who took the train home to her mother on Sunday evening, intact and unspoiled. Marriage prospects did not survive stories of hotel suites and men who wore uniforms they had not earned. In 1946, a woman's value was still measured in silence, in the unblemished surface of her reputation, while the rot underneath was everyone's secret business, but no one's to speak aloud. Yet her fingers refused to let go. The top letter bore the crest of a regiment she knew now was fictional, the ink blue and arrogant. "My dearest E," it began, the loop of the E sharp enough to cut. He had written of destiny, of a connection that transcended the mundane horrors of the war, weaving a tapestry of intimacy that made her feel chosen, special, safe. Safe. The word tasted like ash now, metallic and bitter on the back of her tongue. She lowered the letters, the fire dying in the tray, leaving only a blackened curl of paper that smelled of scorched cotton. No. If she burned them, he won. The man who had looked at her with those flat, assessing eyes, who had tied the scarf around her wrists not with passion but with a clinical curiosity, would walk away untouched. He had left marks on her skin that had faded after 3 days, but the bruising on her spirit felt fresh, a deep ache that settled in her marrow whenever she heard the heavy tread of a boot on the pavement outside. Elena stood, her knees cracking in the quiet room, and walked to the small wash basin. She splashed water on her face, the cold shock forcing her eyes open, stripping away the fog of indecision. In the mirror, a stranger stared back, pale and wide-eyed, her hair pinned up in a style that suddenly seemed childish, a costume for a play that had ended in tragedy for others. Doreen Marshall. The name had appeared in the papers that morning, splashed across the evening news, alongside sketches of a man who looked remarkably like the one who had bought her dinner. She dried her face with a rough towel, the texture scraping against her cheeks. Decision made, she wrapped the letters in brown packing paper, tying the string with trembling fingers. The package felt heavy, far heavier than the few sheets of paper should weigh, as if it contained the sum total of her shame. She tucked it into her handbag, beneath her purse and a compact of powder that she would not need today, and pulled on her coat. The street outside was grey, the sky a low ceiling of cloud that promised rain but delivered only a damp chill. Elena walked quickly, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the wet pavement, avoiding the gaze of the few passers-by who hurried past with collars turned up against the wind. Every shadow looked like him, every man in a suit seemed to carry the same air of unearned authority. She kept her head down, focusing on the cracks in the pavement, counting her steps to keep the panic at bay. The police station was a brick monolith on the corner, its windows frosted with grime, offering no view of the interior. Elena paused at the entrance, her hand hovering over the door handle, the wood cold and unyielding beneath her palm. Inside, men with whistles and truncheons maintained order, or so the signs claimed. They were the barrier between civilization and the chaos that had swallowed Doreen Marshall whole. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first as stale tobacco, wet wool, and the underlying scent of boiled cabbage that seemed to permeate every public building in London. A sergeant sat behind a high desk, his head bent over a ledger, a pen scratching rhythmically against the page. He did not look up when she entered, the bell above the door having failed to register in his routine. "Excuse me," Elena said, her voice sounding thin, reedy in the large room. The sergeant stopped writing. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes rheumy and tired, scanning her from hat to hem with a practiced indifference. "Yes, miss. I need to speak to someone about a man." "We are all busy, miss." He dipped his pen again, inkwell glinting under the flickering fluorescent light. "If it's a missing husband, try the Red Cross. If it's a theft, fill out Form B12 at the counter there." "It's not theft." Elena stepped closer, gripping her handbag until her knuckles turned white. "It's about Neville Heath, or Colonel Heath. He uses different names." The pen stopped. The sergeant's expression shifted, not to alarm, but to a weary skepticism that felt heavier than any shout. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and folded his hands across his stomach. Heath, he repeated, the name rolling around his mouth as if testing its flavor. You've been reading the papers, haven't you? Everyone's got a theory these days. Every girl who had a bad date thinks she's met the killer. This isn't a theory. Elena's voice trembled, but she forced it steady. I have letters. He wrote to me. We stayed at the Grand in Hastings. He tied me up. The sergeant sighed, a long, exhaled breath that smelled of mint and decay. He stood up, looming over the desk, his uniform straining at the buttons. Listen, love, we've got bodies piling up. Real ones. We don't have time for hysterics. If this fellow hurt you, why are you only coming forward now, weeks later? I was scared. Aren't we all? He waved a hand, dismissive, as if swatting a fly. Go home, burn those letters, forget you ever met him. You'll thank me when you're walking down the aisle next spring instead of giving statements to the press. The rejection landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing a nuisance, a complication in a day already filled with ration books and blackout complaints. The institution designed to protect her was instead reinforcing the wall of silence that kept women safe only by keeping them mute. Elena stepped back, her heels clicking again, louder this time. You're making a mistake. Perhaps. The sergeant sat down, picking up his pen, but it's not the one that matters. Next. She turned and walked out, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in her chest. The rain had started, a fine mist that clung to her coat, dampening her hair. She stood on the pavement for a moment, the brown package burning a hole in her bag, the urge to run, to hide, to disappear overwhelming. Then she remembered the sketch in the paper, the cold eyes, the smile that didn't reach them. He was still out there, and if the police wouldn't listen, there was someone else who might. Someone who looked at evidence rather than reputation. Detective Inspector Bellamy. She had seen his name in the articles, buried beneath the sensationalist headlines, a man who asked questions about ligature marks and hotel registers while others chased ghosts. Elena wiped the rain from her face, her resolve hardening into something sharp and brittle. She would not go home. She would find Bellamy, even if she had to drag the truth through the mud of every Cafe Tilde copyright in London to do it. The shame was hers to carry, but the justice belonged to Doreen. She pulled her collar up and walked into the rain, heading for the station where the trains to Victoria departed, the package in her bag feeling less like a burden and more like a weapon. The Cafe Tilde copyright on the corner of Victoria Street smelled of chicory and damp Macintoshes, a cloying sweetness that stuck to the back of the throat. Elena pushed through the door, the bell jangling with a cheerful ignorance that made her teeth ache. She scanned the room, eyes darting over the bowed heads of clerks and the weary slump of demobilized soldiers nursing single cups of tea. There in the corner booth, where the light from the grimy window fell weakest, sat a man who looked as though he had been carved from the same grey stone as the city itself. Detective Inspector Bellamy did not look up as she approached. His attention was fixed on a spread of photographs arranged on the Formica table like a macabre solitaire game. He wore a suit that had seen better decades, the elbows shiny with wear, and his hands were stained with the ink of 100 report forms. Elena stopped beside the table, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag until the leather creaked. The package inside felt heavy, dense with the weight of words written in a hand that had traced the contours of her skin before attempting to erase her existence. Mr. Bellamy, her voice cracked, barely audible over the hiss of the espresso machine and the low murmur of conversation. Bellamy lifted his head slowly. His eyes were dark, rimmed with red, holding an exhaustion that went deeper than mere lack of sleep. He looked at her, then at the empty chair opposite him, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Sit down, miss, you're dripping on the floor. She slid into the seat, the vinyl cold and sticky against her thighs. The rainwater pooled around her shoes, a small dark lake on the linoleum. I went to the station, the local one, they wouldn't listen. They rarely do. Bellamy reached for his cup, taking a sip of tea that had long since gone cold. Not unless there's a body on the slab, then they find their hearing aids work perfectly. He gestured to the bundle in her lap. Is that what I think it is? Elena hesitated. The shame rose in her throat, hot and acidic, threatening to choke her. To admit she had gone away with a stranger, to a hotel in Hastings, to allow herself to be bound and terrified, was to invite a judgment far harsher than any legal penalty. In 1946, a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily shattered by gossip and impossible to glue back together. Yet, looking at the photographs, on the table are grainy black and white images of ligature marks, of bruises that bloomed like dark flowers on pale skin. She knew silence was the greater crime. He called himself Colonel Heath, she whispered, the name tasting like ash. He said he needed someone discreet, someone who understood duty. She placed the package on the table. It landed with a soft thud, a stack of letters tied with a fraying blue ribbon. Bellamy did not touch them immediately. He stared at the bundle, his expression unreadable, before finally reaching out with fingers that trembled slightly. He untied the knot, the ribbon slipping away to reveal envelopes bearing postmarks from London, Hastings, and Bournemouth. The handwriting was elegant, looping, deceptively civilized. He wrote about pain, Elena said, her hands clasping each other to stop them from shaking. Not just in passing, he described it, as if it were a meal he was planning. He asked me what I feared most, and then he told me he would bring it to life. Bellamy pulled the first letter from the stack. He read silently, his lips moving almost imperceptibly as he absorbed the words. The Café Tilde copyright noise seemed to recede, the clatter of cups and the murmur of voices fading into a dull roar. Outside, a bus groaned past, its engine coughing black smoke that obscured the view of the street, but inside, the air was still, charged with the presence of evil captured on paper. This confirms the timeline, Bellamy murmured, more to himself than to her. He was in Hastings 3 days before Marjorie Gardner was found, and he used the same alias. He looked up, his gaze sharpening, the fatigue momentarily receding behind a wall of professional focus. Did he hurt you, physically? He tied me with silk scarves. He said it was a game, a test of nerve. Elena's breath hitched. When I cried, he smiled, not a cruel smile, a satisfied one, as if I were performing exactly as he had rehearsed. She swallowed hard, forcing the next words out. I managed to undo the knots when he went to the bathroom. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was on the train back to London. And you kept the letters? I thought if I burned them, it would never have happened. A tear escaped, tracking a hot path through the rain-cooled dust on her cheek. But Doreen didn't run, did she? Bellamy's hand stilled on the second letter. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just a witness, but a survivor carrying the burden of those who hadn't made it. The hardness in his eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second, revealing the man beneath the detective. No, miss, Doreen did not run, and Marjorie did not leave the room alive. He gathered the letters, stacking them neatly, aligning the edges with precise, deliberate movements. These are not just evidence of a crime, they are a map. He doesn't choose women at random. He chooses women who are alone, who are trying to make their own way in a world that tells them they need a man to protect them. He uses their independence against them. The realization settled between them, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't a spree, it was a campaign. A systematic hunting of women who had dared to step outside the narrow boundaries prescribed by society, only to be trapped by the very freedom they sought. Elena felt a shiver run through her, not of fear this time, but of a terrible, clarifying anger. "What will you do with them?" she asked. "I will build a case that even the press cannot twist into a melodrama," Bellamy said, his voice low and steady, "and I will make sure that when he stands in the dock, he cannot charm his way out, not this time." He tucked the letters into his inner pocket, patting the fabric as if reassuring a child. "You've done a brave thing, Elena, braver than you know." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing the rain and tears. "It doesn't feel brave. It feels like betraying a secret I promised to keep." "The secret was never yours to keep," Bellamy replied. "It belonged to him, and now it belongs to us." He stood up, buttoning his jacket, the movement snapping the tension in the air. "Go home, lock your door, and if you see him, if you even think you see him, you do not approach. You come straight to me." Elena nodded, standing on legs that felt like water. She watched him turn away from the table, the letters disappearing into the depths of his coat, a weapon drawn against the dark. As he walked towards the exit, pushing through the door into the grey afternoon, she realized that the silence she had carried for weeks had finally broken. The noise of the city rushed back in, loud and chaotic, but beneath it, she could hear the faint, steady ticking of a clock counting down. Bellamy paused at the threshold, looking back once, his silhouette framed against the dull light of the street. "We have him now," he said, though whether he was speaking to her or to the ghosts in his pocket remained unclear. Then he stepped out into the rain, leaving Alina alone with the dregs of her tea and the sudden, terrifying hope that justice might actually be possible. He unfolded the paper, revealing a stack of envelopes bound by a fraying blue ribbon. Cream stock, expensive, the sort reserved for wedding invitations or funeral notices rather than the casual correspondence of a soldier on leave. Bellamy lifted the top one, turning it over to inspect the postmark. London, Hastings, Bournemouth. The ink was black, distinct, the loops of the handwriting precise enough to suggest a man who measured his words before committing them to the page. He did not speak immediately, letting the weight of the paper settle in his palm, while the Caf Tilde copyright noise swelled around them. A waiter dropping a spoon somewhere near the counter, the metallic clatter ringing out like a warning bell. Alina watched his thumb trace the signature on the front. Neville, never Heath. Always a rank, always a title that commanded obedience without question. She wanted to reach across the table and snatch them back, to stuff them into her bag and run out into the rain where the grey water might wash the ink away until nothing remained but a blur of suspicion. Instead, she kept her hands locked in her lap, the knuckles white, forcing herself to remain still while the detective read the private thoughts of a monster. "He wrote about discipline," she said, the words scraping against her throat. "He said pain was a cleansing agent, something that purified the spirit if administered correctly." Bellamy lifted his eyes from the page. They were tired, the skin beneath them bruised with fatigue, but the gaze was sharp, cutting through the steam and the shadow to fix on her face. "Did he administer it to you?" "Not fully," she swallowed, the sound loud in the small space between them. "He tied me, silk scarves. He said it was a test of nerve, a game for officers and ladies. When I cried, he did not stop. He smiled." Her breath hitched, a jagged intake of air that shuddered through her ribs. "I told him I had to leave. He let me go, as if I were a toy he had grown bored with." Bellamy laid the letter down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. He picked up the next one, glancing at the date before setting it aside without reading the contents. The movement was deliberate, a small ritual of order imposed upon chaos. Marjorie Gardner was found with ligature marks consistent with silk, deep bruising, patterned. He paused, letting the name hang in the air, heavy and final. Doreen Marshall vanished from a hotel in Bournemouth, the same week this letter was posted. Alina flinched. The names were not just words in a newspaper, they were ghosts now sitting at the table with them, watching her with accusatory eyes. She had survived because she had run, because she had broken the rules of the game he had set, but the guilt of survival tasted sharper than the cold dregs of tea in her cup. "I thought if I burned these, it would erase me from his story. I didn't want the scandal. A woman alone in a hotel room, people talk. They assume the worst." "The worst happened anyway," Bellamy said, his voice flat, devoid of judgment but heavy with fact. "He chooses women who are trying to make their own way, women who travel alone, who work, who think they are safe because they are respectable. He uses that respectability against them." He gathered the letters, stacking them into a neat pile, the blue ribbon coiling beside them like a shed snake's skin. "This isn't opportunism, Alina. It's a campaign. He hunts women who have stepped outside the boundaries men set for them, and he punishes them for it." The realization landed between them, suffocating the ambient noise of the Caf Tilde copyright. It was not a spree of violence born from madness, but a calculated correction of social order, executed with a fountain pen and a silk scarf. Alina felt a shiver run through her, not of fear, but of a cold, clarifying anger that burned away the shame she had carried for weeks. She had not been careless. She had been targeted. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "I will build a case that cannot be twisted into a melodrama for the papers," Bellamy replied. He tucked the bundle into his inner pocket, patting the fabric once, as if reassuring a child. "He cannot charm his way out of this, not with these." He stood up, buttoning his jacket, the movement snapping the tension in the air like a dry twig. "Go home, lock your door. If you see him, you do not approach. You come straight to me." Alina nodded, standing on legs that felt unsteady, like water poured into a glass. She watched him turn away, the letters disappearing into the depths of his coat, a weapon drawn against the dark. As he walked towards the exit, pushing through the door into the grey afternoon, she realized that the silence she had carried for weeks had finally broken. The noise of the city rushed back in, loud and chaotic, the clatter of cups and the murmur of voices returning to fill the void he had left behind. Bellamy paused at the threshold, looking back once, his silhouette framed against the dull light of the street. "We have him now," he said, though whether he was speaking to her or to the ghosts in his pocket remained unclear. Then he stepped out into the rain, leaving Alina alone with the dregs of her tea and the sudden, terrifying hope that justice might actually be possible. She sat back down, the chair creaking beneath her weight. The table was empty now, save for the stain where the package had rested, a faint square of cleanliness on the stained cloth. Outside, a bus groaned past, coughing black smoke that obscured the view of the pavement, but inside the air was still, charged with the presence of evil captured on paper and carried away in a detective's pocket. Alina picked up her cup, the china cold against her lips, and drank the tea anyway, needing the warmth to settle the trembling in her hands. The letters were gone, but the words remained, etched into her mind, a permanent record of the man who had tried to write her out of existence. The envelope arrived with the afternoon post, smelling of damp wool and the coal smoke that clung to everything in London since the war ended. Bellamy slit it open with a thumbnail, the paper resisting slightly before giving way with a tear that sounded too loud in the quiet office. Inside lay the typewritten sheet from Bournemouth, the ink still glossy where the pathologist had signed his name at the bottom. Doreen Marshall. The words sat on the page, black and absolute, anchoring a second body to the first one already cooling in the morgue. He read the description of the ligature marks twice, then a third time, tracing the line of text with a finger that trembled just enough to blur the letters. Silk, deep bruising, patterned, the same vocabulary used for Marjorie Gardner, lifted from a different file but belonging to the same hand, the same cruel imagination. It was not a coincidence. Coincidence belonged to drunkards and gamblers, not to a man who selected his victims with the precision of a surgeon choosing instruments. This was a pattern, deliberate and repeating, stretching from the locked room in Paddington to the windswept beach in the south. "So?" Bellamy looked up. Sergeant Evans stood in the doorway, holding a tray with 2 chipped mugs and a pot of tea that smelled of boiled rags. The young man's face was pale, shadows dug deep under his eyes from 3 nights of no sleep. He set the tray down on the corner of the desk, careful not to disturb the stacks of papers that threatened to avalanche onto the floor. "Any word from the locals?" Bellamy asked, his voice rough from disuse. "They're dragging their feet, sir. Say they need written requisition before they'll share the full autopsy photos. Bureaucracy." Evans spat the word like it was a bad taste. "They think we're trying to steal the glory or dump the work on them." "Glory?" Bellamy snorted, a dry, humorless sound. He poured the tea, the liquid brown and weak, barely staining the water. "There's no glory in this. Just 2 dead women and a killer who knows how to use a train schedule better than we know how to use the law." He pushed one mug towards Evans, keeping the other for himself. The heat radiated through the ceramic, a small comfort against the chill that had settled in his bones. "Get me Chief Inspector Wilson on the line. Tell him I have evidence linking the Marshall death to the Gardner murder. Tell him if he doesn't cooperate, I'll walk down there myself and arrest every officer in the station for obstruction." Evans hesitated, his hand hovering over the mug. "Sir, protocol say, sir." "Protocol got Marjorie Gardner killed," Bellamy snapped, the sudden violence of his tone making the sergeant flinch. "And it let Doreen Marshall walk into a trap while we filed forms. Do it." "Yes, sir." Evans grabbed the phone, dialing the number with fingers that moved too fast, clicking the receiver hard against the cradle. Bellamy turned back to the report, forcing his eyes to scan the details again. The bruising on Marshall's wrists matched the width of the scarf found in Gardner's room. The angle of the ligature suggested a suspension, a hanging that wasn't meant to kill immediately but to display. It was theatrical, grotesque, a performance staged for an audience of one. Heath. The name floated in his mind, unbidden, attaching itself to the facts like rust to iron. He had seen the man's description in the early missing persons files, a charming officer type with a penchant for military affectation. a ghost in uniform haunting the hotels of the South Coast. The phone rang, a shrill, jagged noise that cut through the room. Evans answered, speaking quickly, his voice dropping to a murmur as he relayed Bellamy's ultimatum. Bellamy ignored him, focusing on the map spread out on the desk. Red pins marked the known locations: London, Bournemouth, the intermediate stops where checks had bounced. A line connected them, jagged and erratic, showing a man moving south with purpose, fueled by forged documents and a confidence that bordered on the manic. "He's heading for the coast," Bellamy said, more to himself than to Evans. "Not just Bournemouth, further, somewhere with boats." "Wilson says he'll send the photos by special delivery," Evans reported, hanging up the phone. "But he wants a guarantee we won't leak to the press. They're already sniffing around, sir. The News of the World has a man camped outside the Bournemouth morgue." "Let them camp," Bellamy muttered, picking up his pen. He dipped it into the inkwell, the nib scratching against the paper as he began to draft the Joint Task Force order. "They want blood, they can print it, but they don't get the details of the wounds, not yet." He wrote quickly, the handwriting tight and angular, each letter a brick in the wall he was building around the case. "If the papers print the specific nature of the ligature marks, we lose the ability to test any suspect's confession. We need to keep something back, something only the killer would know." "And if they print it anyway?" Evans asked, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. "You know how they are, sensation sells more than truth." "Then we fight them in court," Bellamy said, not looking up. "And we pray the judge has more sense than the editors." He paused, the pen hovering over the paper. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. Releasing the information could help catch Heath, alerting witnesses who might recognize the description. Withholding it protected the integrity of the trial, but risked letting the killer slip through a loophole created by headlines. It was a choice between justice and order, and neither option felt clean. He signed the document with a flourish, the ink soaking into the fiber of the page. "Send this to Wilson, and get the banking ledgers from the fraud squad. I want to see every transaction Heath made in the last month, even the small ones, especially the small ones." "Right away, sir." Evans took the paper, folding it neatly before tucking it into his pocket. He lingered for a moment, looking at Bellamy with an expression that mixed respect with pity. "You should go home, sir, get some sleep. You've been at this for 40 hours. "Sleep won't bring them back," Bellamy said, his voice flat, "and it won't stop him from buying a ticket to France." Evans nodded, understanding the futility of the argument, and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Bellamy was alone again, the silence pressing in on him, thick and oppressive. He picked up the report on Doreen Marshall, reading the final paragraph where the pathologist noted the time of death. It coincided perfectly with the window Heath had vanished from his London lodgings. The timeline locked into place, click after click, like the tumblers of a safe opening to reveal the horror inside. 2 women, maybe more, all dead because a man decided their lives were props in his private theater. He stood up, walking to the window and pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the street was grey and wet, the pavement reflecting the dull glow of the street lamps that had been turned on despite the blackout regulations being officially lifted. People hurried past, heads down, collars turned up against the damp air, eager to get home to rationed dinners and cold fires. They didn't know. They couldn't know that a monster was walking among them, buying tickets and checking into hotels, smiling at clerks and porters while carrying the memory of strangulation in his hands. A knock at the door broke his reverie. It wasn't Evans. A uniformed constable stepped in, holding a slip of yellow paper. "Message just came in from Waterloo, sir," the constable said, extending the paper. "Railway police. A ticket collector remembered a man matching the description, bought a single to Poole, paid in cash, but he argued about the change, complained about the new coins." Bellamy took the slip, the paper crisp and smelling of pencil shavings. Poole, a port, a gateway to the Channel Islands, to France, to anywhere beyond the reach of a British warrant. "When?" Bellamy asked, his voice tight. 2 hours ago, sir. Train's already left." Bellamy crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound sharp and final. The net was closing, but Heath was faster, slipping through the gaps like water. He grabbed his coat from the rack, the wool heavy and smelling of stale tobacco. "Get the car," he ordered, striding past the constable, "and alert the Dorset police. Tell them he's on the move. Tell them to check every ferry manifest leaving tonight." "Sir, without the requisitioner." "Screw the requisition," Bellamy shouted, the anger finally boiling over, hot and bright. "If we wait for the post, he'll be in Spain. Move." He pushed past the constable, his boots hammering against the floorboards as he headed for the stairs. The hunt had changed. It was no longer about gathering evidence or building a case for a jury. It was a race against the tide, against the ticking clock of a man who treated murder as a sport and escape as his right. And Bellamy knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his gut, that if they didn't catch him at the next station, they might not catch him at all. The constable flinched, a reflexive twitch of the shoulder that betrayed the shock of hearing a senior officer invoke hell so casually. He did not argue further, turning on his heel with a snap of polished leather soles against the corridor tiles, the yellow slip of paper left crumpled in Bellamy's fist like a dead bird. Bellamy stood alone in the doorway, his heart racing and a surge of fear masking the exhaustion that had been gnawing at his bones for 2 days. He needed air, not the stale, recycled atmosphere of the station, thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the sour tang of fear, but the cold, damp reality of the street outside. He shoved the crumpled note into his trouser pocket, the paper digging into his thigh, a physical reminder of the gap widening between them and Heath. Down the stairs he went, taking them 3 at a time, the banister rough under his palm, varnish worn away by decades of hurried grips. The ground floor buzzed with the low hum of typewriters and the sharp ring of telephone bells, a cacophony of bureaucracy that felt suddenly absurd, painfully slow against the velocity of a man running for his life. A sergeant looked up from a ledger, mouth opening to offer a greeting or perhaps a query about the requisition forms, but Bellamy swept past him, a dark coat billowing like a cape, his face set in a mask of such singular purpose that the man thought better of speaking. He burst out onto the pavement, the night air hitting him like a physical blow, cold and laden with the scent of coal smoke and damp asphalt. London breathed around him, a wounded giant trying to sleep, its windows darkened where the blackout curtains had not yet been fully drawn back, leaving patches of shadow that seemed to harbor secrets. A bus rumbled past, its headlights cutting a weak, yellow swath through the gloom, the passengers inside mere silhouettes leaning against the glass, tired faces illuminated for a second before vanishing into the dark. Bellamy flagged down a passing taxi, the vehicle a pre-war saloon with a patched roof, and a driver who eyed him with suspicion until the detective flashed his warrant card through the open window. "Waterloo," Bellamy said, yanking the door open and throwing himself onto the back seat, the upholstery cracked and smelling of old rain. "And step on it. I'll pay extra." The driver grunted, a non-committal sound that suggested he had heard it all before, but he engaged the gear with a grind of metal that spoke of engine wear, pulling away from the curb with a lurch that sent Bellamy sliding across the seat. They merged into the sparse traffic, the city unfolding outside the window in a blur of bomb sites and scaffolding, skeletal remains of buildings that stood as grim monuments to the war that had only just ended. Bellamy watched the streets fly by, his mind racing ahead of the car, mapping the route Heath would have taken. Poole was not the destination, it was a conduit. A man with Heath's pretensions, his obsession with status and the trappings of authority, would not hide in a fishing village. He would seek a hotel, somewhere with a dining room where he could wear his borrowed uniform and command attention, somewhere he could continue the performance that had cost 2 women their lives. The thought made Bellamy's stomach turn, a physical revulsion that had nothing to do with the motion of the car. "Heath," Bellamy muttered, the name tasting like ash. "You arrogant bastard." The driver glanced in the rear-view mirror, his eyes catching Bellamy's reflection for a fleeting second before returning to the road. "Say something, sir." "Nothing," Bellamy replied, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Just thinking aloud, how long to Waterloo with this traffic?" 20 minutes if the lights hold," the driver said, shifting gears with a clunk, "but the bridges are a mess. Still clearing the debris from the last raid on the docks, might have to go round." Bellamy swore under his breath, the frustration tightening his chest. 20 minutes was an eternity when a killer was 2 hours ahead, moving towards the coast where the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police dissolved into the murky waters of local constabulary rights and international borders. He needed to be on that train, or at least ahead of the next one, ready to intercept a man who treated human life as a disposable commodity. The taxi slowed as they approached a diversion, cones and barriers funneling traffic onto a narrow side street lined with shuttered shops. A poster, peeling from a brick wall, advertised a dance at the local hall, the faces of the dancers smiling vacantly above the words, "Keep smiling through," a slogan that now felt like a cruel joke played on a nation that had seen too much darkness to believe in simple cheer. Bellamy looked away, unable to bear the dissonance between the optimistic print and the grim reality of the chase. They reached the station 23 minutes later, the taxi skidding to a halt on the wet cobbles outside the main entrance. Bellamy threw a shilling at the driver, not waiting for change, and sprinted up the steps, his boots echoing in the vast high-ceilinged concourse. The station was quieter now, the rush hour long gone, leaving only a scattering of travelers huddled on wooden benches, wrapped in coats and scarves, guarding their luggage with the wary eyes of those who had learned to trust no one. Bellamy scanned the departure board, the chalked destinations glowing faintly under the gaslights. Poole, Bournemouth, Weymouth. The southern coast lay out before him like a menu of escape routes. He spotted a railway policeman standing near the ticket barrier, his uniform crisp, his posture alert. Bellamy marched over, flashing his card again, the movement sharp and impatient. "The train to Poole," Bellamy demanded, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the station. "The one that left 2 hours ago. Did it stop at any intermediate stations? Did anyone get off?" The policeman blinked, surprised by the intensity of the approach, but he straightened up, recognizing the authority in Bellamy's tone. "It stopped at Surbiton and Woking, sir. Standard service. No one reported getting off, but it's dark out there. Hard to see much from the platform." "And the next train?" "Goods train going through in 10 minutes, sir. Passenger service doesn't run this late unless there's a special." Bellamy clenched his jaw, the muscle feathering in his cheek. A goods train, slow, stopping frequently, vulnerable to delays, but it was all he had. "Get me on it," Bellamy ordered, turning towards the tracks. "I don't care if I have to ride in the brake van, and send a telegram to the Dorset Constabulary. Tell them Neville Heath is likely heading for Bournemouth or Poole. Tell them to check every hotel, every guest house, anywhere a man in a uniform might check in without showing papers." "Sir, the telegram lines are down for maintenance," the policeman said, hesitating. "Won't be up until morning." Bellamy stopped, his hand hovering over the door leading to the platforms. The news hit him with the force of a physical blow, staggering him for a second. No telegram, no warning. The 48-hour lag of the post, the fracture in jurisdiction, the broken lines of communication. The very infrastructure of the country was conspiring to protect the killer. "Then drive," Bellamy said, his voice low and dangerous. "Find a car, a fast one, and get to Dorset before I do. If you see a man matching the description, do not arrest him, do not even speak to him, just follow him, keep him in sight until I arrive." "And if he tries to board a ferry, sir?" Bellamy looked at the man, his eyes hard and devoid of mercy. "Then you shoot the tires of his car, you block the gangway, you do whatever it takes to keep him on British soil. Do you understand me?" The policeman nodded, the gravity of the order settling on him. "Yes, sir." "Go," Bellamy commanded. He watched the man run towards the station master's office, then turned back to the tracks, the darkness of the tunnel mouth swallowing his gaze. Somewhere out there, in the night, Neville Heath was sitting in a first-class carriage, perhaps pouring himself a drink from a flask, smiling at the steward, believing himself untouchable. He thought the chaos of the post-war world was his ally, that the cracks in the system were wide enough for a monster to slip through. Bellamy stepped onto the platform, the cold wind whipping his coat around his legs. He was tired, so tired that his bones ached, but the fire in his gut burned brighter than the exhaustion. He would not let Heath win, not tonight, not ever. The train whistle blew in the distance, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the brick arches, signaling the approach of the goods train. Bellamy checked his watch, the luminous hands glowing green in the dark. 11:42 p.m. He had until dawn, just until dawn, and then the world would know exactly what kind of evil had been walking among them. The goods train arrived not with a scream, but a groan, steel wheels grinding against rusted tracks, as the locomotive exhaled a cloud of white steam that smelled of wet coal and old grease. Bellamy climbed into the brake van, his boots slipping on the oily floorboards, and slammed the door against the draft that whipped down the platform. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of paraffin and stale tobacco, a single oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows against the stacked crates of rationed tinned meat and government-issue wool. He sat on a wooden bench that vibrated with the rhythm of the engine, pulling the ledger from his inner pocket. The paper felt dry, brittle at the edges, smelling faintly of the damp office where it had been stored. He opened it to the page marked Heath, N., the ink still fresh, where he had added the latest entries himself. "Show me the money," he whispered, the words lost in the clatter of the coupling chains. His finger traced the columns, moving from London to Bournemouth, following the trail of forged signatures that danced across the page like a macabre waltz. Each entry represented a night in a hotel, a meal eaten while others queued for scraps, a bottle of wine consumed while the city drank tea made from carrot peelings. The numbers were small, insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a map of a man running out of time. A cheque cashed at Lloyd's in Kensington, 2 days later a withdrawal in Brighton, then silence, then a sudden spike in Bournemouth, dated yesterday. Bellamy tapped the paper with a grimy fingernail. The pattern was clear, a straight line drawn in ink and desperation leading directly to the coast. Heath was not hiding, he was spending, treating the economy of a starving nation as his personal treasury. The audacity of it made Bellamy's stomach turn, a physical revulsion at the sheer arrogance of a man who believed rules applied only to others. The train lurched, throwing him against the wall. Outside, the darkness rushed past, broken only by the occasional flicker of a signal light or the lonely glow of a farmhouse window. Somewhere in that black expanse, Heath was sleeping or perhaps drinking, confident that the distance between them was insurmountable. He was wrong. Distance was just a matter of time, and time was the one thing Bellamy refused to yield. He closed the ledger, the sound sharp in the confined space. The vibration of the train traveled up through his legs, settling in his teeth, a constant reminder of the momentum carrying him forward. He needed sleep, but the image of Doreen Marshall's face, pale and still on the mortuary slab, kept his eyes open. She deserved more than a closed file and a shrugged apology. She deserved the truth, however ugly it proved to be. A knock on the metal door broke his reverie. "Inspector." The voice was muffled, young and unsure. Bellamy stood, his knees cracking in the cold, and slid the door open. A railway worker stood there, cap pulled low, holding a telegram form that fluttered in the wind. "Message for you, sir," came through the line at Woking. "They fixed the breach just in time." Bellamy snatched the paper, his hands steady despite the chill. The message was short, typed in the jagged font of the telegraph office. "Suspect seen boarding ferry service AT Pool. Ticket purchased under name Colonel Heath. Departure imminent. Local constabulary awaiting orders." The wind seemed to stop. The noise of the train faded into a dull roar in his ears. Pool, the ferry, Europe. "When?" Bellamy asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. 20 minutes ago, sir." The worker who sold the ticket remembered the uniform, said the man tipped him £0.50, unheard of these days. Bellamy crushed the paper in his fist. £0.50, a bribe large enough to feed a family for a week, tossed away like a matchstick. The sheer waste of it, the casual cruelty of a man who could spend so freely while the country starved, ignited a cold fury in his chest. "Turn this train around," Bellamy ordered, stepping out onto the coupling. "Get me to Poole." The worker shook his head, eyes wide with fear. "Can't do that, sir. Goods train, no reverse authority. We have to go forward to the junction, then switch." "How long?" "Hour, maybe more." An hour, the ferry would be halfway to France by then. Heath would be gone, vanished into the continent, where extradition was a nightmare of paperwork and delays. The investigation would dissolve into a diplomatic incident, the killer sipping cognac in a Parisian caf a tilde copyright while Bellamy drowned in requisition forms. No. Is there a car at the junction? Bellamy demanded, grabbing the worker's lapel. A police car, anything fast. Maybe a patrol vehicle, but the petrol coupons. Forget the coupons, I'll sign the order myself, just get me there. The train slowed as it approached the junction, the brakes screaming against the wheels. Bellamy jumped before it fully stopped, landing hard on the gravel, rolling to absorb the impact. He scrambled up, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and ran towards the signal box. Inside, a single operator sat amidst a forest of levers, smoking a pipe that smelled of sweet cherry tobacco. He looked up as Bellamy burst in, his face pale in the lamplight. Need a car? Bellamy gasped, leaning against the doorframe to catch his breath. Pool now. The operator hesitated, looking at the ledger in Bellamy's hand, then at the determination in his eyes. He slowly extinguished his pipe, the ember dying with a hiss. There's a rover at the depot. Keys are with the sergeant, but he's asleep in the bunk room. Wake him up. And if he refuses, protocol says. Protocol says a murderer is about to escape justice, Bellamy snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. Do you want his blood on your hands when the papers print the story tomorrow? Do you want to explain to his next victim why you followed the rules? The operator flinched, the weight of the questions settling on his shoulders. He stood up, grabbing his cap. Follow me. They ran across the yard, the gravel crunching under their feet, the cold air biting at their lungs. The rover sat parked under a flickering streetlight, covered in a thin layer of dust and soot. The operator fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly before unlocking the door. It's got half a tank, he said, tossing the keys to Bellamy. Don't scratch her. Bellamy slid behind the wheel, the leather seat cold and stiff. He turned the ignition, the engine coughing before roaring to life, a deep, powerful sound that promised speed. He pulled out of the depot, tires spitting gravel, and merged onto the main road. The dashboard clock read 12:15 a.m. The ferry departed at 1:00 a.m. 45 minutes, 30 miles of dark, winding roads. He pressed the accelerator, the car surging forward into the night. The headlights cut a narrow path through the fog, revealing nothing but the white line of the road and the dark shapes of hedges rushing past. Bellamy gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind focused on a single point, the dock at Poole. He thought of Heath, probably standing on the deck now, watching the English coast recede, smiling that infuriating smile. He thought of the ledger, the forged checks, the wasted money. He thought of Doreen and Marjorie and the silence they had been forced into. Not this time, Bellamy muttered, shifting gears as the car climbed a hill. Not tonight. The road stretched out before him, a ribbon of grey in the darkness, leading straight to the sea. And somewhere at the end of it, a boat waited, its engines idling, ready to carry a monster away from the law. But Bellamy was coming, and he brought the whole weight of a weary, angry nation with him. The speedometer climbed, 40, 50. The engine whined in protest but held. He would make it, he had to, because if he didn't, the noose would remain velvet, soft and unseen, tightening around the necks of everyone left behind. The rover's engine died with a shudder, the radiator hissing steam into the damp salt air of Bournemouth. Bellamy killed the lights, plunging the vehicle into the shadow of a sea wall slick with algae and dead kelp. He sat for a breath, listening to the tick of cooling metal, the distant crash of waves against the shingle, and the low, anxious murmur of voices drifting from the guest house ahead. The Clifton Hotel stood dark against the night sky, save for a single window on the ground floor that glowed with the sickly yellow of a gas mantle turned low. No press vans yet, not here. They had guessed wrong about Poole. The railway workers' fear had been a red herring, or perhaps Heath had simply grown bored of the chase, deciding to sleep before the final flight. Bellamy opened the door, the hinge squeaking a protest he instantly regretted, and stepped onto the pavement. The smell of the sea was heavy, mixed with the stale odor of burnt toast and disinfectant that clung to every boarding house in the county. Sergeant Evans materialized from the darkness beside the car, his collar turned up against the wind. Two local constables waited by the garden gate, their helmets pulled low, hands resting near their truncheons but not gripping them. Tension lived in the stillness of their shoulders. "Windows clear," Evans whispered, nodding towards the glow. "Porter saw him go in an hour ago, paid cash, no name on the register. Room number 4, ground floor, back aspect." Bellamy adjusted his tie, smoothing the crease with a thumb that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the crash of adrenaline leaving his blood. He walked to the gate, the gravel crunching softly under his shoes, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet street. The plan was simple, brittle as old glass: enter, identify, secure, no shouting, no drama that might send a man out the back window into the alleyway where a bicycle leaned against the bins. They moved across the front lawn, keeping to the shadows of the rhododendron bushes. The grass was wet, soaking the soles of Bellamy's shoes, cold seeping through the leather. At the front door, Evans produced a pick, working the lock with a practiced, gentle twist that clicked open with the sound of a dry bone snapping. Bellamy pushed the door inward. The hallway smelled of cabbage water and floor wax. A coat stand held a single raincoat, damp at the shoulders. Bellamy held up a hand, halting the procession. He listened. The house breathed around them, the settling of timber, the drip of a tap somewhere in the kitchen, the faint snore from a room above. But from room 4, a different sound: the scratch of a match, the flare of sulfur, the exhale of smoke. Bellamy moved to the door. He did not knock. He turned the handle and stepped inside, Evans and the constables flowing in behind him to fill the space, blocking the window, blocking the exit. The man in the armchair did not jump. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, a cigarette dangling from long, elegant fingers, wearing a silk dressing gown that shimmered pale blue in the gaslight. Neville Heath looked up, his expression one of mild inconvenience, as if interrupted during a bridge game rather than a manhunt that had spanned 3 counties. "You're late," Heath said, his voice smooth, lacking any trace of the panic that should have been curdling his stomach. "I expected the local Bobby hours ago. Metropolitan Police, I presume. The cut of the suit gives it away." Bellamy stepped forward, keeping his hands visible, empty. "Neville George Cleveley Heath, you are under arrest for the murder of Marjorie Gardner." Heath took a drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange in the dim room, then exhaled a plume of smoke that drifted towards the ceiling like a ghost trying to escape. "Murder? Such a harsh word, detective. We were having a bit of fun. Consensual. Ask anyone who knows me. I'm an officer, you know, former RAF. This is a misunderstanding of the highest order." "You're not an officer," Bellamy said, his voice flat, devoid of the anger churning in his gut. "And she isn't here to ask anything." Heath waved a hand, dismissing the statement with a flick of his wrist. "I require a warrant. You can't just barge in here, disturbing a gentleman's rest. Do you have the proper requisition from the Bournemouth Constabulary? Jurisdiction is a tricky beast, Inspector. I'd hate to see your career stumble over a technicality." The bluff was flawless, delivered with the arrogance of a man who had talked his way out of worse scrapes by relying on the deference others showed to a uniform, even an imaginary one. He leaned back, crossing his arms, the silk of his gown rustling softly. He looked at Evans, then at the constables, expecting them to hesitate, to look to their superior for confirmation of the rules. Bellamy did not look at his men. He stepped closer, invading the circle of light cast by the lamp, until he loomed over the seated figure. The smell of Heath's tobacco was cloying, masking something else beneath it, something faintly metallic and sour that clung to the man's skin. "We don't need a warrant to hold a suspect caught in the act of fleeing," Bellamy said, his voice dropping, low and steady. "And we don't need one to discuss the ligature marks found on Marjorie Gardner's body." Heath's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Specifically," Bellamy continued, watching the man's eyes, "the pattern of the lashes, 16 distinct strokes. The first 8 across the shoulders, shallow, testing the skin. The next 8 deeper, crossing the previous wounds at a 45-degree angle, tearing the flesh down to the muscle. The pathologist noted the spacing was precise, measured. like a ruler had been used. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the oxygen sucked out by the weight of the words. Heath's fingers tightened around his cigarette, the ash crumbling onto the lap of his expensive gown. He did not look away, but the easy confidence in his posture stiffened, the spine straightening against the chair back. "Who told you that?" Heath asked, his voice losing its melodic lilt, becoming sharper, thinner. "That's not public knowledge. The papers didn't have that." "The papers don't know everything, Mr. Heath. They don't know about the bite marks on the left breast, shaped by a set of teeth with a distinct gap in the upper incisors. They don't know about the specific knot used to bind her wrists, a reef knot tightened with a sailor's precision, leaving bruising in the shape of the rope's weave." Bellamy leaned down, bringing his face inches from Heath's. He could see the pores on the man's nose, the slight dilation of his pupils, the rapid pulse beating in the throat exposed by the open collar of the gown. "We know exactly how you held the whip," Bellamy whispered. "We know the weight of it, we know the sound it made when it struck her, and we know that you enjoyed it." Heath stared at him, the mask slipping further, revealing a cold, hard core of calculation beneath the charm. For a moment, the room held its breath, the only sound the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece, counting down seconds that no longer belonged to the killer. Then, slowly, Heath dropped the cigarette to the floor and ground it out with the heel of his slipper. "Well," Heath said, standing up and smoothing the front of his gown, his voice regaining some of its former polish, though the edge remained. "If you have all the details, I suppose there is no point in arguing semantics. One must admire thoroughness, even in one's captors." He raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of surrender that looked more like a performance for an invisible audience. Evans moved in quickly, snapping the handcuffs onto Heath's wrists, the steel clicking loud in the small room. The metal bit into the pale skin, a stark contrast to the soft silk. "Neville George Cleveley Heath," Evans recited, the formal words sounding alien in the quiet bedroom. "You are under arrest. You do not have to say anything." Heath listened politely, nodding along as if memorizing a script for a future role. He glanced at Bellamy as they turned him towards the door, a strange, fleeting smile touching his lips again, not of remorse, but of satisfaction. "You'll have your trial, Inspector," Heath said softly as they guided him into the hallway, "and the people will love it. They always do." Bellamy followed them out, his hand resting on the small of Heath's back, feeling the warmth of the man through the thin fabric. The night air hit them as they stepped onto the pavement, cool and biting. A flashbulb exploded from the bushes across the street, blindingly bright, freezing the scene in a stark burst of white light. A photographer, hidden in the rhododendrons, lowered his camera, grinning in the darkness. The shutter had clicked before Bellamy could shout, before Evans could shield the prisoner. The image was taken, the calm, smiling suspect, the weary detective, the handcuffs gleaming under the street lamp. "Damn it," Bellamy muttered, shielding his eyes against the afterimage burning in his retina. Heath merely tilted his head towards the camera, posing instinctively, ensuring the angle caught his good side. The flash had captured not a monster being dragged to justice, but a star arriving at the premiere. The picture would be on every breakfast table in London by morning, and the trial would belong to the papers before the first witness was even called. Bellamy gripped Heath's arm tighter, steering him towards the waiting car, the weight of the coming circus settling heavily on his shoulders. The arrest was over. The real battle had just begun. The magnesium flare died, leaving a ghostly purple smear across Bellamy's vision that refused to fade. He blinked hard, trying to clear the retina, but the afterimage of Heath's smiling face remained burned into the dark, a grinning spectre superimposed over the wet pavement. Evans shoved the prisoner towards the open door of the Humber Super Snipe, the metal of the handcuffs clinking against the doorframe with a sharp, final sound. "Get in," Evans growled, his hand heavy on Heath's shoulder, forcing the man's head down against the roof lining. Heath complied without resistance, sliding onto the back seat with an elegance that seemed grotesque in the cramped, petrol-fume-stale interior. He adjusted the silk gown around his knees, smoothing the creases as if preparing for a night at the theater rather than a ride to the police station. The fabric rustled, a dry, whispering sound that filled the sudden quiet of the street. "Careful with the upholstery, Sergeant," Heath said, his voice muffled slightly by the closed door, but still carrying that infuriating, polished lilt. "It's genuine leather, I believe. One hates to see good material scuffed by clumsy handling." Bellamy did not answer. He stood on the curb, watching the photographer emerge from the rhododendrons. The man was young, wearing a raincoat that had seen better decades, clutching his speed graphic camera like a holy relic. He grinned at Bellamy, a wide, triumphant expression that showed missing teeth and a complete lack of shame. "Got him, Inspector," the photographer called out, tapping the side of his film pack. "Front page material, the monster and the law. You'll thank me when the circulation figures come in." "You've compromised the identification procedure," Bellamy said, the words tasting like ash. "The courts will throw it out if the jury sees that picture before they hear the evidence." "The courts don't sell papers, Detective. People do." The photographer turned on his heel, scrambling towards a parked motorcycle tucked behind a hedge, eager to race the development process. "Besides, everyone knows who he is. The whole country's been waiting for this face." Bellamy watched him go, the engine sputtering to life, with a cough of exhaust that smelled of unburnt oil and desperation. The noise shattered the fragile silence of the residential street, waking a dog 2 houses down that began to bark with rhythmic, mindless fury. Inside the car, Heath was humming a tune, something light and operatic that drifted through the open window, discordant against the barking and the idling engine. It was a waltz. Bellamy recognized the melody, though he couldn't place the name, a frivolous thing from a world before the bombs fell, before the rationing and the grey skies and the bodies in locked rooms. Heath tapped his fingers against the leather seat in time with the music, his cuffed hands moving with a restricted, jerky grace. "Shut up," Evans snapped from the driver's seat, twisting in his chair to glare at the prisoner. "Not a word out of you until we get to the station." "I'm merely appreciating the evening, Sergeant. It's rather mild for September, don't you think?" Heath leaned forward, his eyes catching the street lamp's glow, bright and unnervingly alert. "Perfect weather for a drive. Much better than being cooped up in a stuffy room with a detective who knows too much about not tying." Bellamy opened the rear door and slid in beside Heath, the leather cold through his trousers. The space was tight, their shoulders brushing, and Bellamy could smell the man properly know not just the tobacco and the silk, but the underlying scent of sweat, sharp and acidic, the smell of an animal that knows the trap has sprung. He pressed himself against the door, maximizing the distance between them, yet the presence of the killer filled the car, expanding to occupy every cubic inch of air. "Drive," Bellamy said to Evans. The Humber pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching over broken glass and wet leaves. They moved slowly through the blackout-reduced streets, the headlights cutting narrow beams through the gloom, illuminating peeling paint on the villas and the skeletal remains of bomb sites that hadn't yet been cleared. Heath watched the scenery pass, his reflection ghostly in the window, superimposed over the passing darkness. "You know," Heath said, turning his head to look directly at Bellamy, his face inches away. "That photograph will do you a favor, Inspector. It humanizes me, makes me look approachable. The public likes a villain they can recognize, someone who looks like them. If I looked like a brute, a ogre, they dismiss it. But this," he gestured vaguely at his own face with his bound hands, "this makes them wonder. It makes them doubt." "It makes you a target," Bellamy replied, keeping his gaze fixed on the back of Evans's cap. "There are people in this city who lost daughters to men like you. They won't care about your angle." "Men like me," Heath chuckled, a soft, dry sound. "There are no men like me, Thomas. That's the point. I'm singular, a unique specimen. You can put me in a cage, you can hang me from a rope, but you can't categorize me, and that terrifies you more than the bodies do." Bellamy felt a cold prickle run along his spine, a reaction he refused to acknowledge. He looked out the window, watching the blurred lights of Bournemouth fade as they headed towards the main road, towards London, towards the inevitable machinery of the law. The car hit a pothole, jarring them both, and Heath laughed again, louder this time, a genuine sound of amusement that grated against Bellamy's nerves. "The trial will be a spectacle," Heath continued, undeterred by the silence. "The press will eat it up. They'll describe the whip, the marks, the silk. They'll sell every sordid detail to housewives in Manchester and miners in Wales. And you know what they'll really be buying? Not justice. They're buying permission. Permission to imagine themselves in that room. Permission to feel what she felt. Stop it, Evans warned, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Why, it's the truth. You're hunting a monster, Inspector, but the public wants a story. And I, Heath settled back into the seat, crossing his legs despite the cuffs, am a magnificent story. Bellamy closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of the man, the smell of the silk, the sound of that confident, rolling voice. He thought of Doreen Marshall, of Marjorie Gardner, of the quiet, terrible stillness of the mortuary slab. He thought of the files waiting on his desk, the stacks of paper that would now be drowned out by the roar of the tabloids, the photograph, that smiling face frozen in silver halide, beaming out from every newsstand, turning murder into Matin A tilde copyright E entertainment. The car accelerated, the engine droning a low, steady note that vibrated through the floorboards. Heath began to hum the waltz again, softer this time, a private soundtrack to his journey towards the gallows. Bellamy kept his eyes closed, counting the seconds, measuring the distance, trying to find a solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. The arrest was done. The paperwork would be filed. But the image of that smile, bright and unrepentant in the flashbulb's glare, would linger long after the rope had done its work. They turned onto the main highway, the darkness swallowing the town behind them. Ahead, the road stretched out, black and endless, leading towards a capital city that was already waking up to print the lie. The Humber's tires hummed a low, steady drone against the tarmac, a sound that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of Bellamy's shoes and settle in his jaw. Outside, the blackout curtains of Bournemouth's seafront villas formed a continuous, unbroken scar along the road, hiding the private griefs of 1,000 households. Heath had stopped humming. He sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, the steel cuffs gleaming dully under the dashboard's single green bulb, looking for all the world like a passenger waiting for a train rather than a man being transporting to face the hangman. Nearly there, Evans muttered, his voice tight, gripping the wheel as if it might twist out of his hands. Good, Heath said, his tone light, conversational. I do hope they have tea. One gets frightfully parched after all this excitement. Bellamy shifted his weight, the leather seat creaking beneath him. He watched the back of Heath's neck, where the collar of the borrowed shirt met the skin, clean and unmarked. It was impossible to reconcile this neatness with the butcher's work found in room 21 of the Norfolk Real. The mind sought a sign, a physical deformation, some outward mark of the rot inside, but found only the smooth, pale column of a man who shaved every morning without fail. You'll get your tea, Bellamy said, and a cell, and a solicitor if you can find one willing to take the brief. Oh, I shouldn't worry about that, Inspector. There are always takers for a cause C A tilde copyright L A tilde double dot Brie, especially one involving a gentleman of my standing. Heath turned his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching upwards. Though I suppose gentleman is a flexible term these days, much like justice. The car slowed as they approached the police station, a brick building that looked too solid, too permanent for the transient chaos of the coast. A lone constable stood by the gate, his helmet pulled low against the damp air, smoking a cigarette that glowed like a dying ember in the dark. He straightened as the headlights swept over him, flicking the butt into the gutter and stepping forward to unlatch the heavy iron gates. Pull her in, Evans, right up to the steps. The engine cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The air inside the car felt thick, pressurized, as if the atmosphere itself was resisting the finality of what was about to happen. Then Heath opened his door, swinging his legs out with a deliberate, almost theatrical grace. He stood on the pavement, stretching his limbs, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a long journey. Charming evening, he remarked to the constable, who stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Do watch your step on the cobblestones, slippery stuff, Jew. Bellamy emerged from the other side, his movements heavier, less fluid. He motioned for Evans to take Heath's arm, but the prisoner walked willingly, his pace measured, matching the detective's stride without needing to be urged. They moved through the gate, the iron clanging shut behind them with a finality that echoed off the brickwork. Inside the station, the air smelled of floor wax, stale tobacco, and the distinct metallic tang of fear that seemed to cling to the walls regardless of how often they were scrubbed. A few officers looked up from their desks as the trio entered, pens pausing mid-sentence, eyes tracking the man in the ill-fitting suit who walked with the confidence of a owner. Whispers started, low and urgent, passing from mouth to mouth like a contagion. "That's him, the one from the papers, Heath." "Take him to holding cell 3, Bellamy ordered, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Strip search, standard procedure, then leave him be." "Of course, sir," Evans said, guiding Heath towards the corridor that led to the cells. Heath stopped at the threshold, turning back to face Bellamy. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed, casting harsh shadows under his eyes, yet his expression remained composed, untouched by the grim reality of the tiled room behind him. "You know Thomas," he said, using the Christian name with an intimacy that made Bellamy's skin crawl. "You've done very well, better than I anticipated. Most coppers are dreadfully slow on the uptake, but you have a certain flair for the dramatic. Reciting those details in the car, inspired, really drove the point home." "It wasn't drama," Bellamy said, his voice flat. "It was evidence." "Evidence, drama, semantics," Heath shrugged, the movement fluid, effortless. "The result is the same. I'm here, you're there, and tomorrow the whole country will be talking about us." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just remember, when they're printing the stories, when they're selling the pictures, I'm the one they'll remember. You'll just be the fellow who opened the door." Evans tugged gently at his arm. "Come on, mate, let's chat." Heath allowed himself to be led away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, fading slowly until the heavy door of the cell clanged shut. The sound reverberated through the station, a dull iron thud that seemed to seal not just the man, but the entire case, into a box from which there would be no return. Bellamy stood alone in the bustling office, the noise of the station rushing back in to fill the void of the ringing telephones, the clatter of typewriters, the shouted orders. He walked to his desk and sat down, the chair groaning under his weight. A stack of files lay waiting, topped with the preliminary report from the forensic lab. He picked up his pen, the nib hovering over the paper, but he didn't write. His hand trembled just slightly, a fine vibration that he quickly stilled by pressing his palm flat against the desk. Outside, beyond the thick brick walls, a camera flash popped, bright and sudden, illuminating the window for a fraction of a second. Then another. The press had found them. They were already gathering like vultures, circling the building, waiting for a glimpse, a quote, anything to feed the morning edition. Bellamy could picture them out there, the reporters with their notepads and their hungry eyes, ready to turn tragedy into circulation figures, pain into profit. He picked up the file again, forcing his focus onto the typed words, the dry language of pathology and procedure. Ligature marks, consistent with silk cord, abrasions consistent with whipping. The words swam before his eyes, losing their meaning, becoming just shapes on a page. He blinked hard, trying to clear the image of Heath's smile from his mind, that calm, assured expression that promised the ordeal was far from over. Sir Evans stood in the doorway, his cap in his hands, looking unsure. The photographer, he got a shot of him going in, smiling, looked like he was posing for a wedding. Bellamy looked up, meeting the sergeant's gaze. He saw the worry there, the understanding that the battle for the narrative had just begun, and that the arrest was merely the opening gambit. "Let him have it," Bellamy said, his voice rough. "We can't stop them printing what they want. Just make sure the file is watertight, Evans, because that smile is going to be on every breakfast table in Britain tomorrow, and we need to make sure the truth is loud enough to drown it out." Evans nodded, lingering for a moment before turning to leave. Bellamy watched him go, then turned his attention back to the window. The flashes continued outside, pulsing in the darkness like a frantic, erratic heartbeat. Somewhere in the cell block, a man was humming a waltz. The smell of stale tobacco smoke clung to the wallpaper, a grey film that no amount of scrubbing could lift, mingling with the damp wool odor of Bellamy's own coat. He sat at the small table in the corner of the CID room, the only space left untouched by the chaotic sprawl of the evening shift. A single electric bulb swung gently above him, casting a shifting shadow that danced across the stack of folders before him. These were not merely papers. They were the dissected remains of 2 lives, reduced to typed statements and photographic plates. Doreen Marshall's file lay on top. The photograph showed a young woman smiling into a sun that no longer shone on her, her hair pinned back with a carelessness that now felt like an accusation. Bellamy traced the edge of the print with a finger calloused from handling too many rough surfaces. To include the full description of her injuries in the indictment felt like a second violation, a stripping bare of her dignity for the gawkers in the public gallery. Yet to soften the language, to euphemize the brutality, would be to let Heath's charm blur the edges of what he had done. He uncapped his fountain pen, the ink well dry and crusted at the rim. A drop of black fluid hung from the nib, threatening to fall and stain the page, a permanent mark of error. He wiped it on a scrap of blotting paper, the action deliberate, slowing his breathing. The law demanded precision, but the human cost demanded mercy, and the two rarely sat comfortably in the same room. How does one describe the tearing of flesh without sounding like a butcher? How does one speak of the silence of a dead girl without sounding like a poet trying too hard? A knock at the doorframe broke his concentration. Mr. Justice Hallett's clerk, a thin man named Peters who smelled perpetually of peppermint and anxiety, stood waiting. "Mr. Hallett is ready, Detective Inspector," Peters said, his voice high and tight. "He wishes to review the letter before we finalize the opening statement. He is concerned about the tone." "The tone?" Bellamy asked, closing the file on Doreen. The sound was sharp, a finality that echoed in the quiet room. "He feels Mr. Heath's prose is rather compelling. Eloquence can be dangerous, sir. Juries are susceptible to a man who writes well." Bellamy stood, his knees cracking, the stiffness of a long day settling into his bones. He gathered the intercepted letter, the paper crisp and expensive, smelling faintly of the cologne Heath had worn to his arrest. It was a chilling document, written with the casual flair of a travelogue, detailing movements and encounters with a detachment that bordered on the sociopathic. To use it as evidence of premeditation was necessary, but to read it aloud in court was to invite the jury to admire the very monster they were meant to condemn. "Let him worry about the tone," Bellamy said, picking up his hat. "I'll worry about the facts. The words are his, but the blood is ours to prove." They walked through the corridors of the courthouse, the floorboards polished to a dull shine by decades of nervous footsteps. The air here was different from the station, heavier with the scent of old wood and the dust of legal precedent. In the clerk's office, Hallett sat behind a desk piled high with briefs, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. He looked up as they entered, his expression grave. "Thomas," Hallett said, gesturing to a chair, "sit. We have a problem, this letter." He tapped the document. "It reads like a confession, yes, but it also reads like a performance. Heath knows how to manipulate language. He treats this trial as another stage. If we present this without context, we risk making him appear intellectual, sophisticated. The jury might forgive a clever man more easily than a brute." "He is a brute, sir," Bellamy said, his voice low. "The cleverness is just the wrapping paper. We cannot hide the contents." "No, we cannot, but we must frame it carefully." Hallett removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We will introduce it not as a literary sample, but as a map of his movements. Every adjective, every flourish, must be tied to a specific time and place where a body was found. We strip the poetry from it until only the timeline remains." Bellamy nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction. To dismantle Heath's artistry, to reduce his grandiose pronouncements to mere coordinates of death, was a form of justice in itself. "Agreed. I will prepare the cross-reference with the forensic timeline. Every sentence he wrote will be matched to a wound." "Good." Hallett leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "There is another matter, the families, Mrs. Marshall and Mrs. Gardner. They must be prepared for what comes next. The press will not be kind. They will dig into everything past relationships, financial troubles, any hint of impropriety. They will try to find a reason why their daughters deserved what happened." The thought made Bellamy's stomach turn. He had seen it before, the way the spotlight of a sensational trial could burn the victims a second time, exposing their private sorrows to the harsh glare of public scrutiny. He had to go to them, to warn them, to ask them to endure one more ordeal for the sake of the truth. "I will visit them tomorrow," Bellamy said, before the proceedings begin. It is a terrible task, Hallett murmured, looking out the window at the grey London sky, to ask grief to speak again. It is the only way to ensure he does not walk free on a technicality or a sympathetic whim. Bellamy stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. If we do not tell their stories properly, Heath wins. Even in the dock, he wins. He left the courthouse into the chill of the evening, the city wrapped in a thin mist that clung to his coat. The streets were quiet, the blackout curtains drawn tight against the memory of bombs, though the war had been over for a year. People moved quickly, heads down, eager to reach the warmth of their homes and the meager rations waiting on their tables. Bellamy walked towards the bus stop, his mind already turning to the conversations he would have to endure the next day. He found Mrs. Marshall in a small semi-detached house in a suburb that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp earth. She opened the door with a look of wary recognition, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She did not invite him in immediately, standing in the hallway as if blocking an intrusion. "Detective Inspector," she said, her voice trembling, "have you news? Is it finished?" "Not yet, Mrs. Marshall," Bellamy said, removing his hat. He held it in his hands, feeling the rough fabric. "The trial begins soon. I came to prepare you. What happens in that courtroom? It will be difficult. They will ask questions about Doreen, about where she went, who she saw. The newspapers will print things that might hurt." She flinched as if struck. Why must they know she is dead? Can they not leave her be? "Because he will try to make her seem less than she was," Bellamy said, the words heavy in the small hall. "He will try to make you doubt her, to make the jury doubt. We must be ready. We must hold fast to the truth, no matter how ugly they try to make it appear." Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and hot. She nodded, a small, broken movement. "For Doreen," she whispered. "I will do it for Doreen." Bellamy left her there, the weight of her sorrow pressing against his chest as he stepped back out into the street. He visited Mrs. Gardner next, enduring a similar scene of grief fortified by a fierce, brittle anger. By the time he returned to his flat, the night was deep and the city silent save for the distant rumble of a lone bus. He sat at his small dining table, the forensic timeline spread out before him. Dates, times, locations, train schedules, hotel registers, a mosaic of movement that led inevitably to violence. He checked the sequence again, his finger tracing the line from London to Bournemouth, from the rented room to the locked door. Every detail had to align, every second accounted for. A single discrepancy, a missing hour, a confused witness, could be the crack through which Neville Heath would slip away, smiling, back into the shadows. The clock on the mantel ticked, the sound loud in the quiet room. Tomorrow, the machinery of the law would grind into motion, slow and inexorable. The witnesses would take the stand, the evidence would be presented, and the story of two dead women would be told in the cold language of the court. Bellamy picked up his pen, making one final note in the margin of the file, ensuring the ink was dry before he closed the cover. Outside, the first hint of dawn began to bleach the sky, turning the black to a bruised purple. Somewhere in the distance, a newsboy began to shout the early headlines, his voice carrying the promise of sensation and sale. The trial was about to begin, and the air in the courtroom would soon be thick with the expectation of blood. The ink on the final annotation had not fully dried before the room demanded air. Bellamy pushed the file away, the leather cover sliding across the polished wood with a dry rasp that sounded too loud in the stillness. His fingers smelled of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of the nib, a scent that clung to him like a second skin. He needed to move. Sitting here, surrounded by the ghostly architecture of Heath's movements, felt like complicity. Downstairs, the street was waking up. A milk float rattled over the cobbles, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the wet stones, a rhythmic clatter that marked the start of another grey day. Bellamy stepped onto the pavement, pulling his collar up against the damp chill that seeped through his wool coat. The sky above was a bruised purple, bleeding slowly into a pale, sickly yellow as the sun struggled to pierce the London fog. It was not the clean light of a new beginning, but the hesitant glow of a city holding its breath. He walked without destination, letting his feet carry him away from the flat, away from the timelines and the photographs of wounds that he knew by heart. The rationing posters on the brickwork were peeling, their bold promises of make-do and men now looking frayed and tired, much like the people shuffling past him in the queue for the baker's shop. They stood in silence, huddled against the morning bite, eyes fixed on the shop door, as if salvation lay behind the frosted glass. No one spoke. Conversation was a luxury reserved for those with enough energy to spare, and everyone seemed running on empty. Bellamy turned a corner, the sound of his own footsteps echoing slightly in the narrow alley. He thought of Mrs. Marshall's face, the way her hands had twisted the hem of her apron, knuckles white against the faded cotton. She had agreed to stand in that box, to let strangers pick over the bones of her daughter's life, all because he had asked it of her. The weight of that request sat heavy in his gut, a stone he could not dislodge. Was it right to drag them back into the fire, just to ensure the flame was extinguished properly? A lorry groaned past, exhaust fumes billowing black and acrid into the narrow space between the buildings. Bellamy coughed, waving the smoke away, his eyes watering. The smell of burning oil mixed with the damp rot of the river nearby, a pungent reminder that the war might be over, but the grime remained. He checked his watch. 8:30. The Old Bailey would be filling up now, the clerks arranging their papers, the judges donning their wigs, preparing for the theater of justice. He should be there, he needed to be there. Yet his feet dragged, reluctant to cross the threshold into the noise and the scrutiny. Inside those walls, Heath would be waiting, probably smiling. That infuriating, polished calm that had allowed him to walk through police cordons and deceive hotel managers with such ease. Bellamy clenched his fists inside his pockets, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to shake that composure, to see the crack in the porcelain mask before the judge passed sentence. Turning back towards the main road, he caught sight of a newsstand. The headlines were already screaming from the placards, bold black letters demanding attention. Sadist trial today. Horror at the ROYALE. The words were crude, sensational, designed to sell papers to a public hungry for shock. They reduced Doreen and Marjorie to plot points in a grisly serial, stripping them of their humanity, just as Heath had done. Bellamy felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, directed at the printers, the editors, the whole machinery that fed on tragedy. Paper Gov, the vendor, a man with a face lined by smoke and wind, held out a copy. His eyes were bright with the promise of a busy morning. Big one today, the Heath fellow, they say he's not saying a word. Bellamy stopped. He looked at the paper, then at the man. Keep it, he said, his voice rough. I know the story. The vendor shrugged, tucking the coin into his apron. Suit yourself, though folks want to read it, want to see what he looks like. Proper monster, they say. He's just a man, Bellamy muttered, more to himself than the vendor. A man who made choices. He walked on, leaving the newsstand behind. The crowd thickened as he approached the courthouse, a sea of hats and coats surging towards the entrance. Police constables stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a barrier against the press photographers who jostled for position, their cameras raised like weapons. The flashbulbs popped, brief, blinding bursts of light that illuminated the eager, hungry faces of the onlookers. It was a circus. A grotesque parade where the victims were the main attraction, and the killer was the star. Bellamy flashed his warrant card to the sergeant at the door, slipping past the barrier before anyone could stop him for a quote. The hallway inside was cooler, the noise dampened by the high ceilings and thick stone walls, but the tension was palpable, humming in the air like a live wire. Clerks rushed past with stacks of files, their faces tight with importance. Barristers in full wig and gown whispered in huddled groups, their voices low and urgent. He found Hallett near the entrance to court number 1. The prosecutor was adjusting his gown, his expression grim. He looked up as Bellamy approached, relief flickering in his eyes. You're here, Hallett said, keeping his voice low. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind. Never, Bellamy replied. He smoothed his tie, feeling the knot tight against his throat. Is he ready? He's in the dock, looking as if he's about to attend a garden party. Hallett shook his head, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He nodded to the gallery, actually nodded, as if he owns the place. Bellamy felt a cold knot form in his stomach. That was the danger, not the evidence, which was solid, but the performance. Heath knew how to play the room, how to use his charm as a shield. They had to be sharper, faster, unyielding. Let him nod, Bellamy said, his voice steady now, the doubt pushed down into the dark corners of his mind. Today, we don't need him to speak. We just need the truth to be loud enough to drown him out. Hallett nodded, straightening his shoulders. Then let's begin. The judge is entering. The heavy doors swung open. A hush fell over the crowd, instant and absolute, as the usher cried out the traditional call. All eyes turned to the bench, then to the dock. And there he was, Neville Heath, immaculate in a dark suit, hair slicked back, face composed in that maddening, polite mask. He swept his gaze across the room, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on Bellamy before moving on, dismissive and cool. Bellamy took his seat, placing his file on the table. The leather felt cold under his hand. He opened it, the pages rustling softly in the silence. The timeline lay before him, a map of death drawn in ink and blood. He took a deep breath, the air thick with dust and anticipation. The clerk began to read the indictment. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, willful murder. Bellamy watched Heath. For the first time, just as the word murder echoed off the vaulted ceiling, he saw it, a flicker, not of fear but of something else, something darker, a spark of recognition, as if the killer finally understood that the game had changed. The noose was tightening, not around his neck yet, but around his narrative. The first witness was called. A woman, small and frail, walked towards the stand. Her hands shook as she took the oath. Bellamy leaned forward, ready to catch her if she fell, ready to build the wall of truth brick by brick. The trial had begun. The knocker fell heavy against the wood, a dull thud that echoed in the narrow hallway of the Clapham Terrace. Bellamy waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as the paint on the doorframe flaked onto his shoe. Inside, footsteps approached, slow and dragging, the sort of movement that belonged to someone carrying weight no scale could measure. When the door opened, Mrs. Marshall stood there in black crepe, the fabric dull and absorbing the weak light from the hallway behind her. She did not invite him in immediately, her eyes sweeping the street behind his shoulder, as if expecting the press to have followed him from the station. "Detective," she said. The word was flat, stripped of greeting. "Mrs. Marshall," Bellamy removed his hat, holding it against his leg. "May I come in?" She stepped back, leaving the door open as she turned towards the sitting room. The house smelled of boiled cabbage and stale tobacco, the scent of a home where the fire had been lit only to keep the damp at bay rather than for warmth. On the mantelpiece, a photograph of Doreen stood in a silver frame, angled slightly towards the empty armchair. Bellamy sat on the edge of the sofa, the springs groaning under his weight, and placed his file on his knees without opening it. "I won't stay long," he said, "but there are things you need to know before Monday." Mrs. Marshall sat opposite him, folding her hands in her lap. Her knuckles were white, the skin tight over the bone. "The papers have already printed her name. They say things. They will print more." Bellamy kept his voice low, steady, avoiding the sharp edges that might cut. "They will print details about where she was found, what she was wearing. They might imply things about her character to explain why she was there." "She was walking home," the woman's voice cracked, a thin fissure in the stone. "She was buying sweets, that is all." "I know," Bellamy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs. "But the defense will try to suggest otherwise. They will try to make the jury believe she invited what happened. They will drag her name through the mud to save him." Mrs. Marshall looked away, towards the photograph. Her throat worked as she swallowed, the movement visible beneath the high collar of her dress. "And you will stop them." "I will object. I will fight every lie." Bellamy paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, heavy with the truth of what he could not promise. "But I cannot stop them speaking. I need you to be ready for it. When you read the headlines, do not believe them. When you hear the whispers in the queue, do not listen. It feels like losing her again." "I know." The room was quiet save for the ticking of a clock on the wall, a mechanical rhythm that counted down seconds neither of them wanted to spend. Bellamy watched the woman, seeing the exhaustion etched into the lines around her mouth, the way her shoulders hunched as if protecting a wound that never healed. He had visited too many families, delivered too many warnings that sounded like threats. The law required transparency, but justice often demanded silence, and he stood in the gap between them, holding the weight of both. "We have the evidence," he said, breaking the quiet. The letters, the witnesses, the forensic reports, they are solid. Solid, she repeated, testing the word. Does solid bring her back? No, Bellamy stood up, placing his hat back on his head. The brim was worn, the felt thinning at the edge. It only ensures he pays for what he took. He walked towards the door, stopping on the threshold to look back. Mrs. Marshall had not moved, her gaze still fixed on the photograph, her hands clasped tight enough to turn the skin white. He wanted to offer comfort, some platitude about closure or peace, but the words died in his throat. There was no peace in this, only the grinding machinery of the court and the hope that it might crush the right man. I will send a car for you on Monday, he said. Do not come alone. Thank you, detective. Bellamy stepped out onto the pavement, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. The street was quiet, a row of identical houses stretching into the distance, each one hiding its own grief behind drawn curtains. He walked towards the corner, his shoes clicking against the concrete, the sound sharp in the stillness. A bus rumbled past, exhaust fumes mixing with the smell of rain on dry dust. He checked his watch, the glass face scratched, the hands moving steadily towards the hour. The file under his arm felt heavier now, weighted with the conversation he had just had. It was not just paper and ink anymore, it was the promise he had made to a woman in black crepe. He turned the corner, heading towards the main road where the taxis waited. The trial would start soon. The reporters would be there, their notebooks ready, their pens sharp. They would want quotes, sensations, something to sell to the public on the morning trains. He would give them nothing. Bellamy raised his hand as a black cab approached, the driver slowing down with a grind of gears. He opened the door and slid onto the seat, the leather cold and cracked. Old Bailey, he said to the driver. The cab pulled away, merging into the flow of traffic. Bellamy leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The image of Mrs. Marshall's hands stayed with him, clasped tight against the grief. He opened his eyes, looking out at the passing city. London was rebuilding brick by brick, but the scars were still visible, gaps in the skyline where bombs had fallen. He touched the file on his knee, ensuring it was secure. The law was like that too, broken, patched, holding together under strain. The cab slowed for a red light. Bellamy looked out the window. A newsstand on the corner displayed the evening papers, the headlines bold and screaming, Heath trial tomorrow. He looked away, focusing on the back of the driver's seat. The words meant nothing to him now. Only the evidence mattered, only the truth. The light changed. The cab moved on. Bellamy took a deep breath, the air in the cab stale with tobacco smoke. He prepared himself for what came next. The courtroom would be crowded. The judge would be stern. Heath would be smiling. He tightened his grip on the file, his knuckles matching Mrs. Marshall's. He would not look away. He would not blink. The machinery was moving, and he was part of it now, a cog in the wheel of justice that turned too slow but never stopped. The Old Bailey came into view, a massive stone dome rising against the grey sky. Bellamy paid the driver and stepped out onto the pavement. The building loomed above him, imposing and ancient. He walked towards the entrance, the file tucked under his arm. The doors were open, people streaming inside. He joined them, one more face in the crowd, carrying the weight of the dead. Inside, the hallway was busy. Clerks rushed past, calling out names. Bellamy ignored them, heading for the stairs. He needed to find Hallett. They had to review the opening statement one last time. He climbed the stairs, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. At the top, he turned left towards court number 1. The noise grew louder, a hum of voices echoing off the walls. He stopped outside the door. He could hear them inside, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of the crowd. He placed his hand on the handle, the metal cold under his palm. He paused, listening to the sounds from within. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The fog did not roll so much as it leaked, seeping from the Thames to coat the iron railings of Pentonville in a greasy yellow film that tasted of coal dust and damp wool. Bellamy stood on the opposite pavement, collar turned up against the bite of the October air, watching the prison gates breathe. They remained shut, immense blocks of wood and iron that swallowed the light, and behind them, the clock inside the governor's office ticked with a mechanical indifference that made his own pulse feel erratic. 9 o'clock. The law allowed no extension, no plea for mercy once the warrant was signed, no pause for the sudden, human realization that a life was about to be extinguished by a trapdoor dropping 6 feet. A lorry rumbled past. its engine coughing black smoke that mingled with the mist, and the driver did not even glance at the man waiting in the shadows. Bellamy shifted his weight, the sole of his left shoe catching on a loose cobblestone. He had not slept. The trial had drained him, not through exertion, but through the sheer grinding friction of listening to details no human should have to articulate in a room full of strangers. He remembered Heath's face in the dock, that polished, officer-class mask slipping only when the lash marks on Marjorie Gardner were described in clinical detail by the pathologist. The man had not wept. He had adjusted his tie. Now somewhere within those brick walls, Neville Heath was likely doing the same, smoothing the crease of his trousers before walking to the scaffold. The silence around the prison was not empty. It was heavy, pressed down by the weight of the crowd that would arrive once the black flag was raised. Reporters from the News of the World and the Daily Mirror would be there within minutes, scrambling for quotes, turning a death into a commodity to be sold on the morning trains to people eating rationed bacon and drinking powdered egg. Bellamy felt a surge of nausea, sharp and acidic, rising in his throat. He swallowed it down. This was the end of the line. The correspondence that had travelled by rail, the frantic telegrams between London and Bournemouth, the weeks of chasing ghosts through rented rooms and hotel registers, it all terminated here, in this grey morning where the state killed a man to prove it could. A gatekeeper emerged from the side entrance, a small figure in a dark uniform who lit a cigarette with cupped hands. The flare of the match illuminated a face lined with exhaustion, someone who had seen too many mornings like this. "Done then?" Bellamy asked, his voice sounding rough, unused. The man jumped, dropping the match into the gutter where it hissed and died. He looked at Bellamy, recognition dawning slowly in the dim light. "Inspector," the gatekeeper said, exhaling a plume of smoke that vanished instantly into the fog. "Just now, 9 sharp, he went quiet." "He spoke?" "Asked for a cigarette, smoked it halfway." The gatekeeper shrugged, a jerky movement of thin shoulders. "Said it was a pity he couldn't finish the book he was reading, that was all." Bellamy nodded, though the gesture felt meaningless. A book, a cigarette. The banality of it stripped away any remaining illusion of grandeur Heath might have cultivated. There was no monster roaring in the dark, no dramatic confession extracted by a weary detective. Just a man who treated murder as a sport, finishing his morning routine before the drop. "Thank you," Bellamy said. "Going home, sir?" "Soon." The gatekeeper nodded again, turning back to the door. "They'll be swarming in 10 minutes. Best be gone before the photographers set up their tripods." Bellamy watched him go, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in his bones. He turned away from the prison, walking down the street towards the main road where the buses would soon begin their rumbling cycles. The city was waking up. Milk bottles clinked on doorsteps, a window opened on the second floor of a terrace, and a woman shook out a rug, sending a cloud of dust into the damp air. Life continued, indifferent to the justice that had just been dispensed behind the wall. He reached the bus stop and leaned against the shelter, the glass panes cold under his palm. His briefcase sat at his feet, containing the files on Doreen Marshall and Marjorie Gardner. They were closed now, the evidence catalogued, the statements signed. The legal machinery had done its work, grinding the truth into a verdict that satisfied the statute book, if not the soul. A bus approached, its destination board reading Holborn. Bellamy stepped forward as it hissed to a halt, the doors folding open. He climbed the steps, the smell of wet wool and paraffin wrapping around him. He paid the conductor with coins that felt cold and slippery in his fingers, then moved to the back of the upper deck. The bus lurched forward, climbing the hill away from the prison. Through the rain-streaked window, Bellamy watched the silhouette of Pentonville recede, disappearing into the fog until it was nothing more than a darker patch in the grey. He opened his briefcase on his knee, the leather creaking in the quiet carriage. Inside, the photographs lay face up. Doreen's smile, frozen in time before the Norfolk Real. Marjorie's eyes, bright and defiant in a studio portrait taken years before the war. He traced the edge of Doreen's photo with a thumb, the paper rough against his skin. Mrs. Marshall would receive the letter today, the formal notification that the sentence had been carried out. He imagined her sitting in that quiet house, the crepe dress still hanging in the wardrobe, reading the words that promised closure but delivered only a hollow space where anger used to be. There was no peace in this, only the cessation of movement. The killer was dead, but the girls remained so. The bus turned a corner, the wheels screeching against the wet tarmac. A young man in a D-Mob suit sat opposite, reading a newspaper with the headline already printed, Heath Hanged. The ink was still wet, smudging the man's thumb as he turned the page. He did not look up, did not notice the detective watching him from the shadows of the seat. Bellamy closed the briefcase with a snap that made the young man flinch. "Sorry," Bellamy murmured. "It's all right," the man said, not meeting his eyes. "Bad business, all of it. Glad it's over." "Is it?" The man looked up then, confusion furrowing his brow. "Well, he's dead, isn't he? Justice done." Bellamy looked out the window again. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing the jagged skyline of London, the gaps where bombs had fallen still visible like missing teeth in a grin. The city was rebuilding, brick by painful brick, but the scars ran deeper than the masonry. "Suppose it is," Bellamy said, his voice low. The bus rattled on, heading towards the center of the city where the clerks would be unlocking their offices and the typewriters would begin their clatter. The files would be archived, the dust settling on the papers until some future historian dug them out to wonder at the cruelty of men. Bellamy tightened his grip on the handle of his case, the leather biting into his palm. He would go back to the office. He would sign the final reports. He would drink a cup of tea that tasted of stewed leaves and sit in the silence of his room tonight. But the image of Heath's calm face, the casual request for a cigarette before the drop, would stay with him. It was a reminder that evil did not always roar. Sometimes it smoked a cigarette and checked its watch. The bus slowed for a red light at King's Cross. Bellamy stood up, moving towards the stairs before the vehicle had fully stopped. He needed to walk the rest of the way. The air inside the bus was too thick, too full of people who wanted to believe that the world was safe now that the monster was gone. He stepped onto the pavement, the cold air hitting his face. The fog had lifted enough to see the spire of St. Pancras piercing the sky, a needle of stone against the grey. He began to walk, his shoes clicking on the wet concrete, the sound lost in the growing roar of the morning traffic. The case was closed. The noose had done its work. But as he walked towards the river, the mist seemed to cling to him, a velvet weight that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Ahead, the queue for the butcher's shop was already forming, people huddled in coats, waiting for a ration of meat that might not arrive. They talked in low voices, heads bent against the wind, unaware of the detective passing them who carried the weight of 2 dead women in a leather case. Bellamy kept walking, disappearing into the crowd, just another grey figure in a grey city, while the sun struggled weakly to break through the clouds. The queue for the butcher shifted forward, a shuffling of scuffed soles on damp stone that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. Bellamy did not join them. He kept his collar turned up against the damp, the leather case handle digging a red groove into his palm, a physical anchor to the morning's work, while the city pretended at normalcy around him. A woman ahead unwrapped a parcel of sugar, the paper crinkling loud enough to make 3 heads turn in unison, greed flashing in eyes that had seen too much scarcity. He passed the shop without breaking stride. Inside his office at Scotland Yard, the air hung still and stale, thick with the smell of coal dust and yesterday's tobacco smoke trapped in the wool of the curtains. The radiator clanked, a lonely metallic cough in the silence, struggling to push heat into the corners where the shadows pooled deepest. Bellamy unlocked the door, the key turning with a gritty resistance that spoke of rust and neglect, then stepped inside and closed the world out. He placed the briefcase on the desk. It landed with a heavy thud that seemed to settle the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of grey light cutting through the window. For a long moment, he simply stood there, hands flat on the scarred wood, listening to the distant hum of traffic from the embankment, a sound so constant it had become part of the building's own heartbeat. The files inside were finished. The signatures were dry. The state had taken its pound of flesh from Neville Heath, dropping him through the trapdoor at Pentonville with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, yet the room felt no lighter for it. Bellamy sat down, the chair groaning under his weight, and opened the case. The photographs of Doreen Marshall and Marguerite Gardner lay exactly where he had left them before dawn, their faces untouched by the violence that had ended their lives, preserved in silver gelatin while their bodies had been subjected to unspeakable things. He picked up Doreen's picture, the edges soft from handling, and looked at the smile that had once charmed a family in Bournemouth before it was extinguished by a man who treated cruelty as a hobby. There was no triumph in looking at her now, only a dull, aching recognition that the law could punish the killer but could not restore the breath to the lungs of the killed. A knock at the door shattered the quiet. "Come in," Bellamy said, sliding the photograph back into the folder without looking up. Sergeant Evans pushed the door open, balancing a tray with 2 chipped mugs and a pot of tea that smelled more of tannin than leaf. He set it down with a clatter, eyeing the open file and the grim set of Bellamy's jaw. "Done then?" Evans asked, pouring the dark liquid. 9 o'clock sharp," Bellamy replied, taking the mug offered to him. The heat seeped into his fingers, a small comfort against the chill that had settled in his bones since leaving the prison gates. He went without a fuss, asked for a cigarette, smoked it halfway. Evans shook his head, leaning against the filing cabinet as he took a sip. "Some haven't got a soul to lose. Makes you wonder what goes on behind those eyes." "Nothing worth seeing," Bellamy said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. He had seen the calculation there, the cold, assessing gaze that measured people not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. "The press will have the extras out by noon. Justice served," they'll scream. "Monster pays." "They'll sell 1,000,000 copies before tea time," Evans muttered, wiping a smear of tea from his lip. "Folks want to hear it's over, want to believe the bad sort gets sorted. And then they'll turn the page, read about the cricket or the price of coal." Evans shrugged, a gesture of weary acceptance that mirrored the mood of the entire force. "World moves on, Tom. It has to." Bellamy stared into his mug, watching the steam rise and dissipate into the gloom. The city outside was indeed moving on, rebuilding its brickwork, queuing for rations, pretending that the war and the monsters it spawned were things of the past. But he knew better. The scars ran deeper than the masonry. The capacity for such casual, polished evil didn't vanish with the hanging of one man. It merely went underground, waiting for the next uniform, the next charming smile, the next opportunity to tighten the velvet noose around an unsuspecting throat. "Archives will want the box by 4, Evans said, pushing off the cabinet. "Chief wants it locked away before the evening papers hit the streets. Don't want any leaks on the final details." "Tell him it's being done," Bellamy said. Evans nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Bellamy alone with the ghosts in the folder. He finished his tea, the liquid bitter and cooling in his stomach, then began the final ritual of the investigation. One by one, he placed the statements, the forensic reports, the photographs, and the correspondence into the brown cardboard box. The paper rustled, a dry whispering sound like wind through dead grass. He stacked them neatly, aligning the edges with a precision that bordered on obsessive, ensuring that the narrative of horror was contained, ordered, and filed away. When the box was full, he tied it with string, the knot tight and secure. He lifted it and walked to the metal cabinet in the corner, unlocking the drawer with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. The drawer slid open with a heavy scrape, revealing rows of identical boxes, each labeled with a case number and a name, a library of tragedies catalogued and forgotten. Bellamy slid the box containing Neville Heath into the empty space, the cardboard rubbing against the metal sides. He turned the key, locking the drawer, and pocketed the chain. The room seemed darker now, the afternoon light fading as clouds rolled in from the east, promising rain. Bellamy walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cool glass, looking out at the yard below where uniforms moved like ants, busy with duties that would never end. The fog was returning, creeping in from the river to wrap the city in its familiar, suffocating embrace. It would hide many things tonight. It would hide the grief of a mother in Bournemouth, the empty chair at a dinner table, the silence where a daughter's laughter used to be. It would hide the fact that while one monster was dead, the world remained exactly as broken as it had been before the drop. Bellamy turned away from the window, picking up his hat and coat. He switched off the light, plunging the room into grey twilight, and walked out into the corridor. His footsteps echoed on the linoleum, a solitary rhythm marking the end of the hunt. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping gently against the glass of the entrance hall, a soft, persistent sound that would continue long after the headlines were forgotten. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the wet evening, pulling his collar up against the damp. The city waited, vast and indifferent, swallowing him into its crowded, shadowed streets. The latch clicked. Evans was gone, leaving the door to swing slightly on its hinges before the draft caught it and pushed it shut with a soft, final thud. Bellamy sat alone in the grey light, the silence of the room pressing against his ears like cotton wool. He lifted the mug. The tea had skinned over, a dark film rupturing as he tipped it to his lips. Cold, he set it down without drinking, the ceramic ringing against the wood. Time to pack it away. His hands moved over the file, fingers tracing the edges of the photographs stacked near the blotter. Doreen Marshall's face looked up from the top sheet, the grainy print doing little to soften the vacancy in her eyes. Marjorie Gardner lay beneath, bound by more than the cord in the evidence bag. He did not look away. To look away would be to grant Heath the victory of forgetting, and Bellamy refused to grant him anything more than the drop. Gathered the papers. The rustle was dry, brittle, like leaves crushed under a boot heel in November. Each sheet represented a week of chasing ghosts through train stations, a day spent interviewing women who flinched at the mention of a uniform, an hour staring at the bruised flesh of a stranger until the details burned themselves into the back of his eyelids. He aligned the corners, tapping the stack on the desk until the edges matched perfectly. Order imposed on chaos. A lie, but a necessary one. The cardboard box waited open-mouthed near the inkwell. He lowered the stack inside, the weight shifting the box slightly to the left. Then the twine. He pulled it from the drawer, the fiber rough against his thumb, and began to wind it around the parcel. Once, twice. A knot tight and secure, biting into the cardboard corners. He severed the end with a pocket knife, the blade snapping back with a sharp metallic click. Finished. Rising from the chair, his knees popped, a small protest from a body that had spent too many hours standing in doorways and crouching over evidence. He carried the box to the cabinet in the corner, the metal beast looming against the peeling paint of the wall. The key came from his waistcoat pocket, warm from his body heat, and he slid it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, oiled resistance, the mechanism inside engaging with a solid clunk. The drawer groaned as he pulled it open. Rows of boxes sat in neat regimentation, each one a sealed tomb. Garcia, 1944. Wilkins, 1945. Heath, 1946. He slid his parcel into the gap, the cardboard scraping against the steel sides, a sound like a match being struck. It fit snugly between the others, just another tragedy catalogued and forgotten. He pushed the drawer shut, locked it, pocketed the key. The room felt smaller now, the air stale with the smell of old paper and the lingering tannin of the tea. Bellamy turned to the window, pressing his palm against the glass. It was cool, damp with condensation from the breath of the city outside. Below, the yard was emptying, the uniforms heading for the canteen or the street, their duties done for the day. They moved with a casual ease that he could no longer muster. Beyond the wall, London stretched out under a bruised sky. The fog was creeping in from the river, a slow, silent tide that would swallow the streets by nightfall. It would hide the queues outside the bakeries, the boarded-up shops, the women in headscarves hurrying home before the blackout. It would hide the grief, too. There was always grief. A mother in Bournemouth would be setting a place at the table tonight out of habit, then remembering. A sister in London would walk past a newsstand and see the headline, then look away. Justice had been served, the trapdoor had fallen, the state had taken its pound of flesh. But the box in the cabinet did not hold the truth. It held only paper. The truth was out there, in the fog, in the silence of the grieving, in the way a man could smile while he destroyed a life. It was in the ration books and the rubble and the way people kept walking, kept queuing, kept pretending that the world made sense. He turned from the window. The room was dim now, the afternoon light failing as the clouds thickened. He reached for the switch on the wall, the Bakelite cold under his thumb. He pressed it. The filament in the bulb faded from orange to black, the glow dying slowly, leaving him in the grey twilight. He picked up his hat from the desk, the felt brim stiff with age, and pulled his coat from the hook. The wool was heavy, damp from the earlier rain, and it settled on his shoulders like a weight. He walked to the door, his footsteps silent on the worn linoleum, and placed his hand on the knob. Outside, the corridor waited, long and shadowed. Beyond that, the street. Beyond that, the city. He opened the door and stepped into the hall, the darkness of the office at his back. The hunt was over. The work remained. The Velvet Noose is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Frenzy, Heath, Haig and Christie, the first great tabloid murderers, Internet Archive. Handsome Brute, the true story of a ladykiller, Internet Archive. Neville Heath, Norfolk Royal Hotel. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.